Good morning. I call this hearing to order. And today's hearing is an opportunity to review the Corps' implementation of the most recently passed congressional authorized WRDA, enacted 2014, in 2016, and 2018. This hearing will also begin to identify future needs to inform the development of a new WRDA 2020. Let me begin by asking unanimous consent that the committee members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. The Army Corps of Engineers is, simply put, the nation's premier water resources expert for our nation. Congress has vested significant responsibility in the Corps to carry out vital navigation, flood control, ecosystem restoration projects for the benefit of our communities and for our nation. Each of these projects has been thoroughly studied by the Corps and authorized by Congress through Biennial Water Resources Development Act. This committee, on a bipartisan basis, right? Yes, has traditionally worked to move a Water Resource Development Act every 2 years and has successfully enacted 3 consecutive Water Resources Development Acts since 2014. Through these WRDAs, this committee seeks to address local, regional, and national needs through authorization of new core projects, studies, policies that benefit every corner of our nation. The core implementation of the Water Resource Development Act, particularly WRDA 2018, is very important for us to understand. We want to know that the Corps implements the law as Congress intended and ensure that the Corps continues to remain responsive to national, regional, and local priorities and to a changing climate, and has the funding to do so. I'm specifically interested in WRDA provisions that involve the National Dam Safety Program, nature-based infrastructure initiatives, using data to enhance operations at our reservoirs, and the Corps' assessment of their authorized project backlog. For my district in California, I am very keenly interested in 2 million people that are bank on the dam in ensuring that this vital dam safety work at Whittier Narrows is completed expeditiously after more than 12, 14 years, something like that, as well as ensuring the Corps has the tools and funding it needs to ensure a reliable source of water for the drought-prone areas in the West. Staying on the 2-year schedule for enacting the next new WRDA is critical to water infrastructure to the nation, and today's hearing starts the process for the development of a 2020 WRDA. But Congress is only half the equation. We must have a partner in the Corps and this administration in requesting funding for the congressionally authorized projects and studies. When the administration includes the words "no new start" in a budget request, that means no new infrastructure. Secretary James, General Spellman, thank you for being here today. I'd like to thank the very much in all of the South Pacific region. I thank them very much for their work and partnership through the years, and I'd like to welcome our stakeholder panel for their participation in today's hearing. I look forward to working with all of you in the development of the next WRDA 2020 in your testimony and your testimony. And at this time, I'm pleased to yield my colleague, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Westerman, for any thoughts he may have.
Thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano, and in a bipartisan manner, I would associate myself with your comments. Very, very good remarks there. Thank you for holding this important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today to discuss the important work that the Corps of Engineers does. I'm proud to be able to work on this committee that has been able to pass 3 major transformational WRDA laws in the last 3 Congresses that are there to improve our nation's water resources infrastructure. With this tremendous accomplishment, I want to urge the Corps to expeditiously implement some of the great reforms from these 3 laws. As we look forward to future water resources legislation, one issue that cannot be overlooked is the flooding that has occurred across the nation. While the Arkansas River, back in my home state and my district, was swollen to historic levels, flooding homes, breaching levees, and devastating farmland, Arkansas is by no means alone in these experiences. Our neighbors in Oklahoma, Mississippi, Missouri, Louisiana, Kansas, Iowa, and beyond have all been affected by heavy rains this year. Unprecedented flooding such as this should serve as a catalyst for us to re-examine infrastructure to ensure it is updated and capable of protecting life and property. These disasters beg an important question. What can Congress do to prevent future flooding? Or more importantly, how can we improve infrastructure within our states to reduce the risk of dam and levee breaches? In Arkansas alone, we've seen an estimated $23 million per day in economic loss along the Arkansas River as barges and boats can no longer navigate our inland waterways. Much of this waterborne commerce is dependent on infrastructure that was initially constructed in the 1960s and 70s and is quickly approaching the end of its shelf life. So as the flooded waters recede across the nation, it is important for this committee to continue its bipartisan commitment to work and pass critical water resources legislation. We can't afford another year of flooded homes and washed out farmlands. This is a sight that none of us want to see, and the American people deserve better than this. I look forward to hearing about the Corps' implementation of the recent WRDAs and hearing constructive ideas from our witnesses across both panels in addressing our future water resources infrastructure needs. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman, for your statement. I now recognize Mr. DeFazio, the chairman of the full committee.
I thank the gentlelady and thank her for holding this hearing to kick off the 2020 Water Resources Development Act authorization. The former chairman, Bill Schuster, got us back on track with doing an authorization every 2 years, and I fully intend to continue in that tradition. The Corps' functions are so critical to many parts of the nation, whether we're talking about navigation or we're talking about flood control, or we're talking about ecosystem restoration, other missions, anticipation of severe climate events with changes in the climate. The Corps operates 2,200 levees, 700 dams, largest producer of clean, renewable hydropower in the United States of America. Many of its functions are critical and benefit us every day. WRDA provides direction to the Corps, we will, as I said, do a 2020 bill, but we do want to look back at the past bills and see whether these bills and the reforms and programs that they proposed have been implemented as intended. It's also critical, and I'm not going to press the secretary on this. We had a former colleague who sat in that role a number of years ago, and I asked him, I said, is this budget adequate to do what the Corps needs to do? And he said, no, it isn't. And the next Monday, he decided he wanted to leave his job for family purposes. So I'm not going to put you on that spot, but as much as possible, you've got to advocate for and tell us your needs so that we can anticipate them. I also intend to fully utilize the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund for its intended lawful purpose, stop diverting funds to other parts of the government, and recapture the funds that have been essentially sequestered somewhere in the bowels of the Treasury on a computer or somewhere. So that bill passed out of committee. I'm pushing my leadership to move that bill through the House. On a daily basis, we have less than 40% utilization to authorize depths at the 50 largest harbors in America. Other places in my district and others, jetties are crumbling, and the faster and the more they fail, the more they cost to repair. And we've got to get at these tasks. We've got to unlock those funds and get the job done. So I welcome the secretary and the general here today, and I mean no disrespect, but I have to go to deal with some aviation issues, but there will be, I'm certain, much interest on the committee, and we look forward to your testimony. Thank you for being here, and thanks to the other witnesses also.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. I now yield to the ranking member for the full committee, Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ranking Member Westerman for obviously holding this very important hearing. In the past, as has been pointed out already, the past 3 Congresses, this committee has passed 3 WRDA bills, and I look forward to doing that again and enacting another one into law in 2020. As we look at the future needs of our country, and one of the most relevant issues continues to be the extensive flooding that we're seeing on the Mississippi River and the Missouri River basins. In 2011, we thought that we had learned our lesson from an historic Missouri River flooding incident, but once again, here we are 8 years later, and we find ourselves in even worse shape. While we don't know what the full cost of this flooding season is going to be, we anticipate that it's probably going to be several $1 billion. And the costs of flood damage are extensive and includes agricultural losses, business interruption, infrastructure damage, and individual and public assistance. The first levee breaches in my district occurred in mid-March, and some ground's been underwater ever since then, flooded for almost 4 months. When farmland is flooded for that long, it can be completely covered in sand, in sediment, and what that does is render it unusable for many years. In my district, I have 81 levee systems and almost 3,000 miles of levees, protecting highly productive farmland and thousands of residents and businesses along the Missouri River, and the Mississippi River for that matter. Virtually every levee from Iowa to Kansas City overtopped or breached from the initial March event, and again in May and June with those flooding events. Almost every levee downstream of Kansas City, they overtopped and breached. And when levees breach, then residents have a very short period of time to collect what belongings they can and get to higher ground. Thousands of acres of farmland become utterly devastated and may never see a crop again. Road closures cost businesses, gas stations, convenience stores, restaurants, retailers, you name it, other businesses, it costs them a lot of income. And ultimately, it costs local jurisdictions a lot of revenue. States, counties, cities, and a lot of other local entities are going to continue to have to spend money that they simply don't have for critical infrastructure repair and municipal services. But the most important impacts of the flood are the impacts on people. I have neighbors, friends, and family that have all been devastated by this flooding event. And the displacement and disruption of people's lives is more than just dollars and cents. It's a disruption of their peace of mind, their feeling of safety, and the prospect of having to pick up the pieces and try to rebuild their lives and their communities. Missourians are tough, and we're going to get through this together, but we can't lose perspective on what was really lost here as we strive for better outcomes from the public policy that we're going to debate here in Congress. It's very important that we hear from our witnesses today about the devastation that this flood has caused, but it's just as important to hear what we think the future needs to be when it comes to managing the upper Mississippi and Missouri rivers. And I believe personally that we're asking the Corps of Engineers to balance too many priorities, that when life, liberty, or life, property, and safety are at stake, then flood control has to be the #1 priority. From Gavin's Point Dam to the mouth of the Missouri River, we are slated to spend only $13 million on annual levee maintenance, while at the same time, we're slated to spend $30.7 million on wildlife reclamation and habitat creation in that same stretch of river. The fact of the matter is there has to be some adjustments made on the consideration of people's lives and their property. And with that, Madam Chairman, I look forward to hearing from a witness today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. I now ask unanimous consent that the letters from the Florida Ports Council and the National Marine Manufacturers Association be included in the record in support of WRDA 2020. Now we will proceed to hear from the witnesses who will testify, and thank all of you for being here, both of you. For panel 1, we have the Honorable R.D. James, Assistant Secretary of Army, Civil Works, and we welcome you. Hello. Major General Scott A. Spellman, Deputy Commanding General for Civil and Emergency Operations, United States Army Corps of Engineers. Welcome to both of you. Without objection, your prepared statements will be entered into the record, and all witnesses are asked to limit their oral remarks to 5 minutes. And Secretary James, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano, Ranking Member Westerman, and all distinguished members of this committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I've been the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works for 15 months, and my goals today are the same as they were when I started. Focus on outcomes, expedite the process, and move dirt, making the best use of all available funds. Since last year, I've had the pleasure to meet with many of you to discuss your views on the Army Civil Works program. Your input is appreciated, and I remain committed to working with each of you. The fiscal year 2020 budget provides $4.8 billion for the Corps, focusing on investments that will yield high economic and environmental returns or addresses a significant risk to public safety. This budget relies on a foundation of strong relationships between the Corps and local communities. It allows us to work together to help manage, develop, restore, and protect their water resources and infrastructure. The budget focuses on the three main mission areas of the Corps of Engineers: flood control, commercial navigation, and aquatic ecosystem restoration. The fiscal year 20 budget supports a Corps program that has a diverse set of tools and approaches to working with local communities, whether this means funding projects with our cost-sharing partners, providing planning assistance and technical expertise, or participating in the national and international conversations on how to best address our future water resource challenges. The budget helps improve our efforts on resiliency and sustainability. The budget also funds 2 new innovative programs in the construction account. One of them is the 1043 program. It's budgeted for $150 million, and that's where the Corps could transfer appropriated funds to a sponsor who decide to construct a project on their own. There's another one, the Innovative Funding Partnership Program, also funded at $150 million, to be used in conjunction with funds voluntarily provided by non-federal interest in excess of the non-federal cost share to accelerate completion of construction of specifically authorized projects. In addition, the budget proposed to extend the authorization for Section 1033 of Order 14 as amended, which under current law expired on June the 10th of this year. Since the enactment of the Water Resources Act of 18, the Chief of Engineers has issued a report with recommendations on 15 proposed water resource projects. I provided a detailed list of all those projects in my official statement that I've submitted to this committee. Since receiving my appointment to ASACW, I focused on how the Corps executes all available funds. This involves identifying needed investments and ensuring that we complete execution in a more cost-effective and efficient way. This approach will ensure better return on the taxpayers' investment and better the lives of Americans. Under my oversight and direction, and with the help of Lieutenant General Semonite and his team, such as General Spellman, the Corps is committed to improving the performance of the Civil Works program. The Corps also is using its engineering expertise and relationships with project partners and stakeholders to develop new approaches to address some of the most pressing water resource challenges facing our nation. And I'd like to say there that we're trying, I feel like the Corps got away from working with their partners. I'm talking about the local people on the ground that the district engineers work with regularly. And we're trying to get back to that. We're trying to invite our partners to meetings. We're trying to make them part of the process and the decisions that we make as a Corps of Engineers. And I feel that's very important. Improving performance and timely delivery of quality products continue to be one of my highest priorities. To that end, I have completed the guidance for all provisions of the Water Resource Development Act of 2018. And much to my distress, I discovered when I took this office in February of 2018, there was guidance outstanding due this committee from 14 and 16. I pledged to myself that after the WRDA 18 was passed, we would not let that happen. I instructed my team to have all guidance out by April the 15th, and we did that with the exception of 2, but I'm proud to tell you today that all of our guidance has been submitted to the committee. I'm committed to ensuring that the United States Army Corps of Engineers continues to do what it does better than any other organization in the world: identify the best ways to manage, design, construct, restore, and protect water resources and its infrastructure. My goal is to achieve the highest economic, environmental, and public safety return for the nation, which will benefit all our citizens. Thank you for inviting me here today, and I look forward to taking any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Major General Spellman, you are recognized.
Good morning, Madam Chairwoman, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about the implementation of recent Water Resource Development Acts, execution of the Corps' Civil Works Program, and our ongoing flood fights across the nation. Again, my name is Major General Scott Spellman. I'm the Corps' Deputy Commanding General for Civil Works and Emergency Operations. I would like to first acknowledge the widespread devastation and serious impacts this year's flooding is creating for many people across the country. The Assistant Secretary and I have witnessed these impacts firsthand during our many visits to the field. Throughout, our Corps personnel have been working tirelessly to help mitigate the effects of these events by providing assistance to states and local communities. This year's flood season continues to challenge many federal and state agencies as well as many local governments. At our highest point, we had over 400 river gauges indicating flood stage across the country and over 183 reported ice jams in our nation's rivers. In the Ohio River Valley, this past fall and winter were the wettest on record in the past 124 years, and we have seen record reservoir levels in our Cumberland River projects. Our personnel in this region have been in the flood fight for over 200 days and counting. Our Mississippi Valley Division has been in the flood fighting on the Mississippi River for the past 260 days and will continue at least for the next several weeks. For the first time in its 88-year history, we opened the Bonnet Carry Spillway twice in one season, which has now been operating for 106 days. Within the Mississippi Yazoo backwater delta, record water levels have impacted thousands of acres of agricultural land as well as many communities. Upstream of St. Louis, the Mississippi reached its second highest stage ever recorded. And even this week, we are closely monitoring a low-pressure system in the Gulf of Mexico that may evolve and produce a surge, elevating the lower Mississippi River to 19 feet above sea level as early as this Friday. On the Missouri River, the flood event that began on March 13th was a combination of rainfall, warm temperatures, and rapid snow melt, all on top of saturated and frozen soil. This condition covered a large area, including central and western Nebraska, southeastern South Dakota, western Iowa, and portions of northern Missouri and Kansas. The ensuing runoff drained into uncontrolled tributaries that were already subject to ice jam conditions, as I mentioned. And this combination of events led to record discharges on a number of rivers where we reached major flood stage in less than 48 hours. This event is still ongoing as prolonged rainfall continues to bring river stages well out of bank from Omaha to the Missouri's confluence with the Mississippi just above St. Louis. On the Arkansas River, the flood event that began in May was also due to intense and prolonged rainfall, again on top of saturated soils that led to record stages and flows from Tulsa, Oklahoma to the river's confluence with the Mississippi. This event is also ongoing as well, and many of our reservoirs in this region have also established new pools of record. In many of these watersheds, our core dams and reservoirs have prevented even more significant flooding downstream of those projects, averting millions of dollars in additional property damage, as well as saving countless lives. Today, I want to assure the committee that our Corps' #1 priority in all of our operations remains life and public safety as we continue to address the many flooding challenges across the country. As of this morning, we have identified over 160 levee breaches that require repair, and we are working with states and non-federal sponsors to expedite that work. We also want to thank this committee and the Congress for the authorities and flexibilities it has provided the Corps to address these and many other challenges. These tools, accompanied with record levels of Civil Works appropriations for the Civil Works program, are making a positive difference. You may have heard our Chief of Engineers speak to the ongoing efforts to revolutionize the way we do business as an enterprise. The authorities provided by this committee continue to enable his initiative. We are working to modernize the traditional delivery of the Civil Works program by utilizing innovative tools to accelerate project delivery, exploring alternative financing approaches, and streamlining our internal processes to improve permitting and regulatory actions. I look forward to highlighting these improvements to our project delivery during our session today and welcome any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, General Spellman and Secretary James, for your testimony. We will now recognize individual members for up to 5 minutes each for questions. And I will start with the questions to both of you. In many parts of the country, we are experiencing more extreme weather events. The Midwest is flooring, and outside the Sea of the West has been in extreme drought other than for a little bit of water. How is the core century-old infrastructure adapting to deal with the changing conditions of today?
Ma'am, we're taking that very seriously in all that we're trying to do. We've initiated several different databases, and we're working with other agencies like the USGS, the monitoring. This past budget, I entered $3 million for gauges in the upper Mississippi River system, looking at snowpack and plains pack in that system. I intend to try to do the same thing in other systems as well as California. But we're not standing by idly and building as usual. We're trying to keep an eye to the future and build in a way that what we do build will serve us all for years to come.
Well, with recent seismic events, were there any problems that you encountered that you were going to have to look at for all dams?
Which events, ma'am?
The earthquake in California.
Oh, my goodness. I can't say that I'm an earthquake expert. I do say that anything we build in the future, and I'm not sure that we haven't done it in the past, but in the future, as far as infrastructure from the Corps of Engineers, will be built for seismic resistance. Even though I live on the New Madrid earthquake fault, I'm still not an expert on earthquakes.
So ma'am, if I could just add, we've had our structural, our geotechs, our engineers out on the 3 dams that are closest to the most recent earthquakes in California, the Isabella Dam, the Success Dam, and the Terminus Dam, and we've had no significant issues to report.
Can you talk about the core role in the forecast inform reservoir, the FIRO operations, in helping the core project adapt to meet current and future needs for the communities we serve?
Yes, ma'am. So I'll start. Our intent is to continue our partnership with the state and local entities as well as academia as we advance this pilot. This pilot began in 2014, and we will wrap it up this year. We're frankly excited about the early results. We had it at Atmospheric River, as you recall, ma'am, back in February, and we were able to use some of the data and advanced monitoring technology to actually make reservoir decisions long before this water hit the ground. So we'll wrap up that report here this year, and we'll look for opportunities where else in the nation that this technology may apply.
How soon can we expect the ability of the Corps to work this program into other type?
Yes, ma'am. So the technology that I had a chance to briefly talk with you before the hearing, the technology that we're talking about is very good for these type of conditions that we're talking about on the West Coast. We are not certain yet scientifically that the same technology will apply to some of the weather patterns that we saw this year, say over Arkansas or Oklahoma or the upper Midwest. We have more work to do.
Thank you. Secretary James, your testimony highlights a provision that reserves $150 million for projects where the non-federal sponsor is willing to contribute more and jump the line. How does this innovative partnership help small, rural, and disadvantaged communities partner with the Corps?
I think the purpose of this process and this innovative funding will allow people that have the money to do that to move forward and do it. I'm not sure it will put them in front of the line of those like myself that has to stay under the original cost share agreement. That's not what it's intended for. I don't think it will work that way. I'm still working with the administration right now to get better handle on how they want this program to work. When you read it, it doesn't look too good, like if you've got the money, put your money up and you can move out. But I'm not sure. I don't think that's what they intend for us to do, but I'm working on finding out.
Well, would we be sure that the small communities are not disadvantaged?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of my concerns, not with this particular proposal by the administration. That doesn't concern me too much, but overall, I am concerned about the areas of this country that don't have the money to put up for infrastructure and for protection. I do not want to leave those people out. They deserve.
You should not. We should not leave them out.
No, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Secretary James and General Spellman, thank you not only for your testimony today, but for the job you do in your service to our country in an area that's extremely important when we talk about safety and the economy and the environment and all those things. And as I've mentioned earlier in my testimony, we did see unprecedented flooding on the Arkansas River this year. To put it in perspective, the river typically flows around 40,000 cubic feet per second. When it gets to 80,000 cubic feet, you really don't want to be on a small boat in the river or maybe even on the river at all. But we were seeing flow rates of 500 to 600,000 cubic feet per second, just an enormous amount of water coming down the river. I was with the governor and others from our congressional delegation on the bridge in Fort Smith. They're on the Arkansas-Oklahoma line, and really was, with all the flooding, the intensity of it, as an engineer, I was pretty impressed with the way that infrastructure held up. I mean, we saw in the magnitude of 1,000 homes flooded. We saw a lot of farmland flooded, but we saw relatively few levee failures, and the infrastructure held up better than I think anyone expected for the condition it was in. General Owens and others there worked well with our state. But in the aftermath of that, at the end of June, Governor Hutchinson ordered a review of Arkansas's levees and created a task force to study and analyze the condition of our levees. And Secretary James, I know you mentioned it's one of your objectives to work closer with the local officials, and that's statewide and in the districts as well. But how is the Corps working with Arkansas and other states who've seen their levee systems damaged to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the levee system?
I'll let General Spellman talk to that, but I can tell you, right now, we aren't able to do a lot because the water hasn't fallen enough for us to get in there and get the soil probings and all we need to see what needs to happen. I can assure you one thing that will happen without any technology or scientific data. When these waters go down in all of these systems, we're going to have major levee slides that are going to have to be prepared before the next flood season. Anytime we have water as high as it's been for as long as it's been, then when the water goes down, geotechnically something happens to that soil and it slides off on the river side of that levee. And that hasn't been reported to you yet at all, but it will be coming because it will happen. I'll let General talk to you, sir, just a moment about how we're moving out so far.
Yes, sir. We have to do this hand in hand with local sponsors, non-federal sponsors who actually own and operate these levees, whether federal levees or non-federal levees, inside the rehabilitation program, so we can, at the appropriate time, get the right designs done and move the money to get these repairs done as expeditiously as possible. So I would just tell you today we have $1.9 billion in known damages on our nation's levee systems. That's primarily in the reach from Omaha down to Kansas City, where the water has fallen enough for us to do the detailed assessments. But from St. Louis, sir, all the way down to New Orleans, and then certainly in your region, we've got to get this water down so we can do the detailed work and come back to the Secretary and the Chief with our requirements.
But you are all hands on deck working with the state and local officials?
Yes, sir.
Not just in Arkansas, but in other areas as well?
Everywhere, sir.
All right. So last word, I worked with Mr. Garamendi to pass a clean reauthorization of the National Levee Safety Initiative to extend its authorization to 2023. Given the severity of flooding and the impacts to our nation's levees just these past few months, it is essential for the Corps to develop more efficient methods to inspect and collect and maintain data in the National Levee Database. I understand you're testing some pilot programs. I'm out of time, but I hope that somewhere you'll be able to talk about innovations in the levee programs.
Yes, sir, and we'd welcome the opportunity to come see you one-on-one and walk you through where we are and where we're going with that program.
I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. What's your name? Mr. Westerman. Mr. Grace, you're recognized. Going to my side. Marcasa Powell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you and good morning. First, I want to thank the Army Corps for accepting my invitation to come down to South Florida, to Monroe County, for that public meeting to understand the effects of the Lake Okeechobee and how you regulate that lake and how that affects the livelihood in South Florida. So thank you for that. And as you know, the Everglades is such an important and critical component of water quality and for the livelihood of Floridians. The success of restoring the Everglades is really going to rely on partnerships and collaborations between state and federal agencies, including the Army Corps. And central to this management is the inflow that comes into Lake Okeechobee, but also managing the discharges from the lake. I find it completely unacceptable that the lake has released contaminated water after Congress has appropriated hundreds of millions of dollars for Everglades restoration in the past 19 years, and that the communities living in the east and west of Lake Okeechobee have received high levels of green-blue algae that have killed fish, that has sent children to the hospitals. We are experiencing such a crisis, a public health crisis in our communities because of the high toxicity of Lake Okeechobee that's coming from the Lake Okeechobee. Also on the south, hundreds of thousands of acres of seagrass has died because of low levels of water coming down from Lake Okeechobee. So clearly something is just not working. And I know that there's a long history. We can talk about what has happened in the past, but I want to take this opportunity to understand what we need to do and to do a better job of protecting the public health as we're regulating the lake. So General Spellman, I know that you mentioned that your mission is and your goal is, or the priority is the life and public safety of your communities, which I would assume public health is a part of that as well. So who do you think needs to be at the table involved in making these decisions, managing the health of the lake and the discharges? And what can the Corps specifically do to avoid another disaster, which we saw last summer?
So the first question, everyone has to be on the table, the federal partners, not just the Corps, but also all state and local agencies. And we think we have that in our governance meetings where Colonel Kelly makes the decisions on releases. I would just say also as a general statement that the Corps is all in. We are going to use all of our operational flexibility from our water control manual at Lake Okeechobee to our construction capabilities, as well as our research capabilities to help the state deal with this water quality issue. There are no short-term solutions, ma'am, to the broad problem that you outlined, but there are a number of projects ongoing all around that lake that will contribute to the long-term solution for your constituents.
Who is right now responsible for measuring the algae levels in the lake?
Measuring.
The levels of toxicity in the lake?
Yes, ma'am. So I think that's probably the Florida Department of Health, possibly the Center for Disease Control, folks in the medical community that deal with water quality.
And are you in close communication with these departments?
Yes.
Would you be able to provide to me a communication plan on, once you understand the levels of toxicity, what the next steps are before you decide to release that water?
Yes, we can share with you how we govern our governance process that's a decision-making that our district commander goes through when he's deciding where and when to release.
Okay. And what do you think we can do in Congress at the federal level to help reduce the risk of the toxicity, both in the short term and the long term, as we release the water into our communities?
Yes, ma'am. As I said, there's a number of, probably about 64 in total in the South Florida Ecosystem Restoration Program that will need continual investment over the ensuing years so that we can get the infrastructure in place to help the state deal with this water quality issue.
Will the $200 million that I requested that has been approved and appropriated to continue the Everglades Restoration Project be helpful, and how quickly can we expect the completion of that project?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. It's going to help us expedite this program. So with the $200 million in the president's budget request, we will complete the Kissimmee River restoration next year. We'll continue our construction and oversight for the C-43 West Storage Basin. We'll continue our construction, oversight, and design for the Indian River Lagoon South on the east side of Lake Okeechobee. That project will be complete in 2022. And of course, we'll continue our development and planning with the South Florida Water Management District for the design of the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir. That's all next year.
Thank you, General. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Ms. Mercosur-Powell. Mr. Graves, you're recognized.
Thank you. I want to follow up on Ranking Member Westerman. You said that your preliminary numbers between Omaha and Kansas City are 1.9.
Yes, sir. That's for the levees that we can get down to the toe and actually do adequate assessments. We know there are many more levees that have been overtopped and damaged throughout the country.
And obviously that it's going to take a little while with those assessments. Do you have any idea what that number might rise to?
Sir, I don't. It's still raining. We've got a large storm coming in here this weekend. We still got a lot of flow in the upper Missouri River that has yet to make its way through the basin. Sir, I don't have a good estimate for you.
So that's just on those breaches that you've been able to get into then?
Yes, sir.
And then real quick, and I don't know if this is for Secretary or not, but as far as the Midwest supplemental goes, when's that money going to hit the ground? We've kind of got a clock ticking out there.
I'm sorry, sir, I didn't
The
understand.
Midwest supplemental dollars that were approved, you know when that money's going to be distributed?
That money has been separated into different line items at this time. The general may have a paper on that, I don't, but as soon as we can get our hands on it, which we don't yet.
Okay.
I don't have the money yet, but it's hopefully pending quickly. But we can start work on some areas pretty soon, but doggone it, the rivers are still just so high, there's not a lot of work we're going to be able to do. Like if we were going to repair a levee, how are we going to get the bar area?
Yeah, no, I understand.
Yes, sir. And so, but the money is coming, but we don't have our hands on it, and I'm not sure how it's divided up.
Okay.
Yes, sir. So of that $3.25 billion in this most of FY19 supplemental that is coming to the Corps, about $2 billion of that, sir, we're able to use nationwide to deal with some of the damages that we've seen to the levees, and then also of our core projects, our locks and dams. The investigations account and the construction account, those are tied to states and regions that were impacted by last year's hurricanes, Michael and Florence, and also the typhoons out in the Pacific.
Is there going to be another supplemental request? I'm assuming there will be as we move forward.
There will have to be. You see how that's split up already, and I can tell you now that might not even take care of Missouri, let alone Arkansas, the rivers now, not the states, the Arkansas River and the Mississippi River. It's just hard to tell, but if I were a betting man, I would bet we will have to have more money to attack the damage that has been done.
Thanks, gentlemen. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Mr. Garamendi, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary James and General Spellman, I think everyone on this committee recognizes the extraordinary pressure that you're under, the flooding across the nation from West Coast all the way to the East Coast and everything in between. We appreciate your service. We appreciate the challenge that you face. I will draw your attention to the reality of change, and that the way in which we have conducted flood operations in the past has been based on historic situations. We're no longer in such a situation. There's a project that's been ongoing in California now for several years called the Forecast Informed Reservoir Operations Program. I draw the attention of the committee to that. This is based upon real-time information that's now available from satellites and other technologies that are available. And we appreciate the implementation of that on the rivers in California, and I suspect it may be applicable across the nation. Now, I have a whole series of questions that I'm just going to submit for the record. No use taking the time of the committee or your time here today, Secretary James. Projects in California and the Sacramento Valley, do thank you for coming out, both of you, for coming out and observing what we're doing in the Central Valley. Interesting article in the Sacramento Bee. If the same downpour that hit Washington were to hit the American River, water would be 30 feet deep in Sacramento. So we know we have problems across the nation. Specifically, General Spellman, Section 204 and Section 1043 provide flexibility for local agencies to conduct programs. Without going into the detail, could you please explain why the Corps is so reluctant to move aggressively using these authorities to devolve programs and construction to the local agencies?
Sir, I would say we do want to aggressively use them. We are after anything, any authority or capability that will allow us to, as the Secretary would say, move dirt or get to construction or complete projects quicker. So, sir, if there are examples in your district where we're not doing that, we would like to know and take action.
We will so inform you. There has been a reluctance to move forward aggressively using these programs, and if that were to happen, projects would be completed quicker, possibly sooner. I can give you one specific example on the Feather River, where the Corps did not allow the local agency to undertake the project. Would have saved significant money. Probably an issue for the rest of the nation as you deal with the flooding that's occurring in the Midwest. I'll leave it at that. I do draw the attention of the committee to the reality of change and the necessity for the flood operations to reflect the new reality and to use information that is now available from multiple areas, satellites to other technologies. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Graves, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary James, General Spellman, I want to thank you very much for being here today, and thank you for your testimony. I think you're familiar with the watershed, the Mississippi River watershed. Certainly, Secretary James, you spent a good bit of time working on that in your career. Right now, we're facing a scenario, as you heard other members talk about, how in Baton Rouge, in my hometown, we are seeing 1.3 million cubic feet of water pass per second through that river system, one of the largest watersheds in the world. We now, as you know, have a tropical depression in the Gulf of Mexico that appears to be coming up in the next few days that by some model projections are going to cause the Mississippi River levees to overflow because of that higher storm surge coming in at the bottom of the levee system. We are draining water from Montana to New York to Canada, all through this huge watershed. What do you say to the folks in Louisiana? What do you say to them that we are draining water from all these other states? As you know, the inputs into that river system are minimal from Louisiana. And because of this huge amount of water that's coming from them, coming from all these other states.
End of the drain.
And now the storm surge is going to cause overtopping. It's not our water overtopping, it's everybody else's water overtopping. It's going to, we've seen impacts to our fisheries, our commercial fisheries, and our recreational fisheries as a result of the Bonacari spillway. As General, as you mentioned in your testimony, normally opened once every 10 years since the 1930s when it was built. We've opened it 4 times in the past 4 years. As you mentioned, the first time in history, twice this year, twice in 1 year. What do you say to people down there when we're experiencing the flooding because of what's happening in the upper basin?
Well, if it wasn't so serious and if I didn't think it would be taken the wrong way, I'd say you better move. But it is serious. And there is so much industry and economic return to this nation from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, and also over in the Atchafalaya and some of the other estuaries down there, that we can't say you better move. That would be very silly. So what we've got to do is start addressing the problems based on, like Mr. Garamendi said, on what we know now, not what we knew in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s.
And Mr. Secretary, we're giving y'all an opportunity to do that. And the WRDA bill became law last year. We included a provision on low river control structure looking at how to do a better job managing the water on Atchafalaya Red, the Mississippi River system, and better utilize old river control structure. As I understand, you're looking at a 3-year study. I just don't think we have 3 years. You've heard the urgency from Ranking Member Graves and others about, Ranking Member Westerman as well, about this issue. I don't think we have that kind of time, and I want to urge you to move quickly. And you're right, we can't move. We're one of the top energy producing states in the nation, top commercial fisheries producing state in the nation, 5 of the top 15 ports in the nation. You can't replicate this capacity elsewhere. I want to pivot and go off what Congressman Garamendi, and I know Congressman Rauda, who is here, has concerns about this as well. You mentioned it in your testimony, 1043. The Corps of Engineers has a $100 billion backlog in authorized projects, $100 billion. One of the ways we can help to speed up the implementation of these projects and help to break down this backlog is to use Section 1043, which provides for local sponsors, state and local sponsors, to carry the projects out. This became law in 2014. The guidance was just issued in June, nearly 4 years later. And so I think that I actually want to follow on Congressman Garamendi's comments. It does appear that maybe the urgency is not there. And then, as you know, in 2018 WRDA bill, Congress extended it. The implementation guidance, we did extend it. There is one technical issue in the extension that I think has become a problem. But if there's a desire on the part of the administration to continue this and to utilize this as a tool to address this backlog and deepening rivers and improving flood protection, ecological restoration, and other core functions, we need to figure out how to get to yes, not how to get to no. Can you talk a little bit about how we're going to move forward on 1043 and what some of your experiences are with McCook Reservoir in Harris County using 1043 to implement?
The experience so far is very good. We have not had any problems. Now, McCook was done a little differently because it was a new venture. The way we did that, we won't be doing again, I don't think. But as far as Harris County, they're tickled to death with it. It's letting them do what they needed to do on those reservoirs down there. It's a good tool for the people that can afford it. There's no doubt.
Mr. Secretary, the 140-page guidance that y'all issued in June basically says that y'all just acknowledge it. It basically is going to be useless at this point because the program expired, yet we did extend it in WRDA 18. I just want to ask you if y'all could go back, work with your attorneys, figure out how to get to yes, not to no, because this is going to be an important tool for us to utilize moving forward. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Ms. Finkenauer.
Well, thank you, Assistant Secretary James, and also Major General Spellman. It's great to have you guys here with us today. So I represent Iowa's 1st Congressional District, right there on the Mississippi. So I have actually quite a few questions, and if in the interest of time, if you can keep it brief, that would be great. First, when I met with Colonel Sadinger from Rock Island back in March, He told me the Cedar Rapids Eastern Floodwall project has been fully funded and construction will start this October. Obviously, great news for a community that was devastated by flooding back in 2008 and desperately needs that flood wall done. I was just wondering if we could get an update from you on the timeline for this project and if there are any remaining hurdles to getting that job done.
No, ma'am, no hurdles that I am familiar with. This year, we've already issued 3 architect-engineer task orders to commence the design, and as you've mentioned, we'll issue the first 2 construction contracts by the end of the fiscal year.
Great, thank you so much. And next, I want to ask about the Navigation Ecosystem Sustainability Program, obviously NESP. This program is obviously critical for farmers and other shippers in my state who use the Mississippi to move their products. Congress authorized this project over a decade ago, but it keeps getting pushed back. So we know there's a backlog of waterways projects, but this year the president has requested a 31% cut to the Corps. To be clear, the Mississippi River is our competitive edge, especially at a time when our farmers are getting hit on all sides due to flooding, but then also because of the trade war. And this is a time where we need to be investing more in our waterways and our infrastructure, not less. Can you help me understand, Secretary James, why the backlog of these projects, including NESP, has been underfunded and why NESP hasn't moved forward more quickly?
I've been familiar with NESP in my prior life as a member of the Mississippi River Commission. In that life, I really felt like we handled that wrong. Since I got here in this job, I have discovered that the Congress and the industry wants to do it as it is, navigation, ecosystem, restoration, sustainability together.
Okay.
And all those years, I didn't think that was a good idea. I thought we should have them separated so they could be funded separately. Now, I got here and I found out that's not what the people want, so I don't even talk about that anymore. But let me address backlog just a minute, Madam Chairman. Mr. Graves said $100 billion backlog, and that's what we put out. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be working on that because I don't believe that. I don't believe we've got a $100 billion backlog. We've got projects that have been authorized for years and years and years. I don't consider those backlog. I only consider projects that have been authorized and appropriated at least $1. That means the Congress is willing to put its money where its mouth is, and I call that backlog.
Yeah, and Secretary James, I'm sorry, I'm just in the interest of time to follow up on that. If it's not the backlog or if it's not the money, what do we need to do as a Congress to move NESP forward?
So far, it's been the lack of will. That's why it hadn't moved forward, and it's very much needed. Those locks and dams in the upper Mississippi River are falling apart.
They are, and I mean, it's authorized over a decade ago, and so I know this is, your oversight on this as well, and we've got to make sure that we're doing this, and we're happy to work with you any way we can to make sure that these projects move forward. They are desperately needed, and thank you for your time as well. And lastly, I do want to follow up as well just about flooding in general. As you know, Iowa farmers endured months of not being able to move their goods down the Mississippi because of the prolonged flooding. This is only going to get worse. These so-called 500-year floods are now happening every 5 years now. Major General Spellman, is the Corps ready to manage the flooding in the Mississippi River, particularly given the need to balance the Corps' other function like navigation and recreation? If we were to redesign how the Army Corps of Engineers manages the Mississippi River watershed, what do you think needs to change or actually work differently so you can more effectively control for flooding?
Yes, ma'am. So after we get through this next flood fight, every year we will conduct an after-action review after we get through this event to see what are the opportunities where we can further improve our operations up and down the basin.
Would it be helpful to have some research on that? And okay, great. Thank you so much, and thank you both for your time today. This is obviously very important, and look forward to continuing these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Finkenauer. Mr. Weber, you're recognized.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm from the Texas Gulf Coast. As Secretary James knows, Hurricane Ike in 2008 hit. Hurricane Harvey a couple of years ago, and my 3 coastal counties were ground zero for Harvey flooding. The implications are just absolutely astounding. And Secretary James, I was glad to hear you say in your earlier comments that you feel like you've identified at least, and feel like it needs some fixing, obviously, that the Corps has gotten away from working with local partners. You also said that that improving performance was one of your highest priorities, and that's good news. The Texas Gulf Coast, one of my good colleagues, friends down there, Sally Baco from Galveston, keeps me reminded on how important this is, because we actually, she's got a sheet for us, and I want to make sure that y'all are following the study that's being done about coastal barrier protection. Some call it the Ike Dike. And this affects not just our district, but all across the country, and there's a whole lot of reasons for that. But just a little history. The WRDA of 2007 actually authorized the Army Corps to develop a coastal Texas ecosystem protection and restoration plan to determine the feasibility of carrying out projects for flood damage reduction, hurricane and storm damage reduction, and ecosystem restoration in the coastal areas of Texas. And like my friend from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, said, things just aren't happening enough. A couple of facts that I think my colleagues would be interested in, and in Texas, in our country, in terms of energy, the Texas Gulf Coast region produces 27% of the nation's gasoline, 60% of the nation's aviation fuel. So it has national security and national economic ramifications. We have 35% of the nation's natural gas production and 42% of the nation's specialty chemical feedstock. So this is national economic implications, national security implications, not to mention there's 6 million people, families, businesses, jobs along the Gulf Coast that need protecting. It's not a matter of if we get another hurricane, it is when. To the General's comment about, I think he said, the depression out in the Gulf you're seeing now, it's just a matter of time that's going to happen. There's some studies being done about the implications of the Coastal Barrier Protection Plan as needed along the Texas Gulf Coast, and it starts at the Louisiana border and goes really all the way down the coast, but mainly in the area of the Gulf Coast that does all of the fuel production. Are y'all mindful of that study, Secretary James? The Army Corps is coming out with some very common stuff, what they call, current stuff called the Tentatively Selective Plan, TSP. And I know that Colonel Lars Zetterstrom did a fabulous job, but people were a little frustrated about the way information was rolled out and the amount of time it was taken, and quite frankly, the plan that was selected. Is your office monitoring that situation, and are you aware of the ways that they're developing that plan and what they're recommending?
I am not, but I will be.
Okay. Well, we would love for you to reach out to them and get, I don't know what the right word is, boned up on it so that you know, because it's super, super important to our district. We have 5 ports on the Texas Gulf Coast. Some have 4, but we have 5. We are the 13th largest exporting district in the country out of 435 members of Congress. So it is huge. The Port of Beaumont moves more military personnel and equipment than any other port in the nation. So it is huge for national security, national economic calculations. For example, when Hurricane Ike hit in 2008, I was told that by John Shimkus, even up in Ohio, up in that area, that fuel spiked about 60 cents a gallon. So we want the Army Corps to be paying specific, close attention to that and make sure that that's getting rolled out in a timely fashion and make sure that that's a priority. And we'd appreciate any feedback you can give us on that. General Spellman, are you aware of it?
Sir, I am. So I would just say, add to your comments, this is a very large and complicated project. And the fact that we've got some energetic comments from the public and industry back on that draft study is important to us. We take that all into account, and that's just going to make that project even better when it does get to...
what was the number of those comments?
Sir, I don't know. It's thousands.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking it's like 8,000. But we really want to focus on the importance of that and the study that was authorized and the fact that it's huge implications, not just for our area, but for the Army, for our national defense, as well as our economy. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back a second. Oh, and if I may, before I do, I want to say happy birthday to my colleague on the left, Brian Mast.
Oh, happy birthday. Thank you, Mr. Weber. Mr. Malinowski, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate a chance to hear from our witnesses and just to reiterate our appreciation for the work that the Corps does. It is vital, it is essential, it is greatly needed. You do it with too few resources. We all make demands on you, which you strive to meet within those limited resources, and I recognize that it is sometimes a challenge. That said, I'm going to make demands on you, because that is our job. In the district that I represent in New Jersey contains portions of the Greenbrook sub-basin and the Rahway River basin. We have significant flooding challenges, particularly the Rahway River. In recent years, it has inundated communities in suburban New Jersey that had not experienced that kind of flooding in past years, and we know it will happen again. We have been working, as you know, with the Corps. Our local elected officials have been working with you for years now to try to come up with a plan to deal with this. We were working fairly well with the New York district for some years, and responsibility for the Rahway River project was moved, as you may know, to the New England district. And whether it is fair or not, I have to say there has been some frustration with that move, both the geographic distance, greater geographic distance of the New England district, and also a sense among some of our local elected officials that proposals that they're sending up are being rejected, but not just rejected, but not with the sort of feedback and input that would help us figure out a way forward. So I think my first question is just, I'm hoping to better understand why the management of the project was moved from New York to New England, and then perhaps we can take it from there.
Sir, a great question. This study has been ongoing for some time. The team from New York District, they outlined 17 alternatives. They looked at 17 alternatives to get after this particular problem set in your district. And we were having a lot of trouble just getting to agreement with the non-federal sponsor on options that would work, that came back that were economically feasible, meaning they had a benefit to cost ratio above 1. So this happens from time when we're just not seeing forward progress. We will move and to try to get another set of eyes, another set of leaders on the problem. I'm taking notes on the frustrations that you've shared on New England District, and I will jump on that, sir.
Thank you. You should expect another proposal from the local sponsors, from the Mayor's Council that has been working on this. And again, I'm not asking for any bending of the rules or special treatment for us. I think we agree that this is something that needs to be dealt with because the flooding will continue to happen. I am asking, I think, for some personal attention from you, and obviously if there's anything that my office can do to help speed this along, to help if there's any communication difficulty, we stand ready to help. It is a huge, huge priority for me and for the people that I represent. So thank you, and let's stay in touch. If I can have your commitment to do that, I will be very, very grateful.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Post, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here, and also, General, thank you. You can pretty well guess what question I'm going to ask, because you and I have spoken about it several times, and that's the Lynn Small levee that's in my district. Let me tell you what's happening right now so we get it on the record. Dozens of landowners and homeowners can only reach their home by boat, and some of them can't reach their home at all because they can't get through the current at which way the level that it's moving through. 2 state highways and a number of roads in the county are submerged, and some have significant damage. The current at the breach site is so strong, we've had 2 occasions where it has actually sucked barges traveling upstream into the breach. Twice it's happened now, but also then the other day, just this past weekend, the current ripped apart a tow and sending several barges through the breach site.
I have a news article describing what happened, and Madam Chair, if I can, I would like to have unanimous consent to enter this into the record. I have been saying for a while that the levee breach is a hazard to navigation. The Lynn Small levee does not qualify because the flood prevention benefits of the levee did not produce a positive BCR. Now, we've worked with you, and we've worked with this committee, we've put things together over the years. Now, I understand it's been going on, not just for this flood case, but it's been going on since after the flood of the holiday flood of 15, and then from 16, it's about 4 or 5 times I've actually spoken in this committee and on the floor showing maps of the danger of the navigational change that may occur there. Now, let me tell you, though, that you know this, that the Corps has spent millions of dollars in riprap under its navigation authority to attempt to stabilize a channel. Let me also explain this. The riprap is gone. It got washed away because unless we make the investment and figure out a way to fix it. So the quick question I have, now we can agree that the navigation threat is no longer just a threat, it's real. We've seen it happen. This is a problem, and we have to fix it. Now, I'm going to ask, Mr. Secretary, shouldn't the Corps consider other economic benefits, like commercial navigation, when conducting the BCR for non-federal levee repair, particularly when the levee structures serves multiple purposes as this one does?
In my opinion, yes, sir.
Okay. I'm looking forward to us working together to try to cure and fix this problem. The constituents and the people along the river are becoming, you know it better than anybody. That's where you're from, right? You can look across the river almost at it. And this is a situation where common horse sense has flown out the window. We are looking at, and this is for members of the committee and to have on record, if we don't cure this problem, and that cut occurs all the way across, now all of a sudden, because of the change in the river level over the 17 miles around that bend, now all of a sudden drops that same level in 3 miles, the navigation stops. That will change the way we transport our goods, whether it's for agriculture or anything else, when we have to all of a sudden stop north of Cairo, transfer off of a barge into trucks, take it south, and then move it that way. This is not a good way to do business. The American people can see it's an issue, but unfortunately, whether it's Congress or working with the Corps, we can't get this figured out. I'm looking forward to making sure we get it figured out and we get it fixed. And I don't know what you would suggest or the general would suggest that we can do, because this isn't going away. We've got to get it fixed.
Congressman Bost, I would appreciate it when your schedule allows that I could come see you.
Look forward to that.
And we'd look into this a little further. I mean, it's been approached so far like a normal levee project, low BCR, blah, blah, blah. I'm not sure we shouldn't look at some of this other information.
It truly is a case where this is when people watch what we do here in Congress. They think, you know what? I'm a simple business person and I can figure this out. Or I'm a simple farmer and I can figure out how to cure a problem when it develops. But yet we've had this problem since, and I'm not blaming you. I thank you for the offer. But I want the people of this committee to know and understand we got to start thinking properly and quit looking like the Congress that can't get anything done on issues like this. We've got to work together and see when a problem is developing to this level so that we can actually focus and work on it. And the people in my district, the farmers there, you know, this isn't about their land anymore. Their land's gone. It is under so much sand, it doesn't matter. You're not going to, you know, unless somebody wants to open up a sand pit down there when we get the levee back in place, there's just not a lot we can do there.
Thank you. Your time is up.
With that, I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I now recognize Congressman Lowenthal for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And my first question is to Mr. James. First, thank you for coming to our committee and describing to us the important work of the Army Corps across the nation. But I want to take this opportunity to mention 2 projects in my district, which I think are moving along. I just want to mention that, maybe also ask General Spellman also about that. One is an ongoing study for navigation improvements at the Port of Long Beach. I represent the Port of Long Beach. And first I would like to say to Mr. James, it would be wonderful to our port complex, the port complex of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which is the largest container port complex in the Western Hemisphere. 40% of the goods of the nation come in and out of LA Long Beach. If you'd come and visit our port complex. We, the Army Corps and the LA District in particular, have been tremendous partners to our port complex. And especially now I'm talking about the Port of Long Beach, ensuring that the port remains a key component or a vital component in the global supply chain. What we're talking about are improvements that will enable the safe navigation of these mega ships, which now have been developed. And so, but we need really help in making sure the navigation that they can come in and out of our harbor. And now, because of the size of the ships, they have to wait until there are tide windows to safely operate. So I just want to alert you to that is moving through the process. In addition, I'm also very proud to represent Orange County, or parts of Orange County, which have experienced substantial population growth in recent decades, and flood control improvements along the Westminster watershed can help to prevent billions of dollars of damage during significant flood events, and they're going to save my constituents millions of dollars of flood insurance premiums. And so I'm hoping that we can have the chief's report signed for that project so we can authorize the needed improvements in the WRDA bill next year. But my question is a little different that I want to ask you. In the past two WRDA bills, Congress has included provisions to encourage the use of natural infrastructure for Army Corps projects, but these project alternatives often face challenges because some of their benefits are difficult to quantify. So the first question is, can you tell me how the Army Corps currently calculates the cost effectiveness of nature-based infrastructure, and has the Corps been working to develop a better evaluation methods for natural infrastructure?
Congressman, if it's okay, I'll let General Spellman take that.
That's fine.
Because I am not cognizant of it.
Okay. General Spellman, we're
Sir, had a
talking
great
about
visit.
now looking towards natural kinds of infrastructure.
Yes, sir. I had a great visit out to your district here in early January. I had in my previous assignment out in the Northwest, I had the opportunity to implement some natural-based infrastructure in some of our flood control projects, and I do look forward to the opportunity in doing that in other parts of the nation as well. So I would have to have our economists come in, and we're happy to do that, to come see you and walk you through the math on how we calculate the cost effectiveness. With the minute 8 remaining, I'd be challenged to do that in a nutshell here this morning, but we'd be happy to come sit down with you.
What I'm saying, though, is that it's sometimes difficult, not because the Army Corps, to measure some of these natural infrastructure cost benefits. And I'm just hoping that the Corps is working on better ways or more effective ways of measuring the impacts of natural infrastructure.
Yes, sir.
And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Congressman Mass from the great state of Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. General Spellman, 9 of the last 11 years, in the name of flood control, water has been discharged out of Lake Okeechobee to Florida's east and west coast. This isn't new news to anybody. My question is simple, pointed, but important. Has the Army Corps of Engineers transferred toxic water from Lake Okeechobee to the east through the C-44 reservoir into the St. Lucie estuary and the Indian River Lagoon, and to the west through the Caloosahatchee River?
Yes, sir. We have conveyed water out the system that have contained cyanobacteria and harmful algae blooms. Yes, sir.
And the Corps considers that toxic?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I appreciate that acknowledgement. It's important so that we can move forward as we try to accurately weigh the risks and assess what's going on as we try to manage both flood control for those to the south of the Herbert Hoover Dike and human health and human safety impacts to those to the east and west of Florida's Lake Okeechobee as we're going summer after summer trying to work through these long-term infrastructure projects that you have been working on and your predecessors have been working on. So I appreciate that acknowledgement. I do want to submit for the record the considerations by both the Center for Disease Control, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and the EPA. If you will take this by unanimous.
No objection.
Thank you. The CDC also notes that microcystins are a potent liver toxin produced by some species of cyanobacteria. Florida Department of Environmental Protection says the mere presence of cyanobacteria blooms warrants the state to issue a warning. The EPA has reported cyanobacteria and their toxins are considered a serious threat to human health, and on May 22, the EPA declared that cyanotoxins above 8 parts per billion posed too great of risk for human contact, and so I appreciate you taking that for the record. I would like to move to simply a thank you, General Spellman. I have in front of me a letter from you to the state of Florida in which you outline, in order to reduce future risk to the public, the Jacksonville District will lower Lake Okeechobee levels as much as possible within the operational band of the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule prior to the start of the hurricane season 2019. And I am giving you the most sincere, I hope you take this as the most sincere thank you that can be given from each of my constituents and from myself. You are making a real difference in our community with this operational and managerial change. For businesses, for people's health, for people's recreation, you are making a difference. It's not going unnoticed, and we want to thank you for that. And in that, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Congressman Ruda for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, General Spellman and Secretary James, for joining us here today. Harley Ruda from Orange County, California. My district is the 48th District of California, represents about 80% of the coastline of Orange County. And there's a couple key projects there. One of the key ones is the Santa Ana River project. And Santa Ana River project was once characterized by the Army Corps of Engineers as, quote, the worst flood threat west of the Mississippi. This river is located entirely in Southern California, the largest river in the area, and it meets the Pacific Ocean between Huntington Beach and Newport Beach. With sea levels projected to continue rising and the increasing intensity of storms and natural disasters, the planned lower river channel modification for flood control along the 30 miles of the Santa Ana River from Prado Dam to the Pacific Ocean is of critical importance to our constituents. We have, as I mentioned, two major projects that we're interested in, the Santa Ana River Mainstream Project and the Westminster and East Garden Grove Project, which rely on Section 1043 authorization. It's estimated that these projects would prevent $40 billion in damages, protect over 100,000 acres from flooding, and benefit over 3.5 million people within Orange, Riverside, and San Bernardino counties during a design storm event. General Spellman and Mr. Secretary, would you both agree that the Santa Ana River Mainstream Project and the Westminster and East Garden Grove projects are critical to maintaining flood safety in Orange County?
Taking from what you say, sir, yes. I haven't actually visited that area yet. It's on my list. Just haven't been there yet. But I think General Spellman may have been there.
Yes, sir. Sir, I visited both these projects from top to bottom, and I agree they're very important flood risk management projects.
And can we kind of go back to a little bit of your testimony a little bit earlier, Secretary? It was about, and General, please jump in as well. I'm just trying to get a better handle of the authorizations, the projects that have been authorized, and how well funded, what the gap is between funding and the projects. Because I believe I read somewhere that based on the president's budget, we are looking at a 100-year time frame to address the currently authorized projects. Of course, that doesn't include any new projects coming on board over that 100 years. So can you give us a little bit more information as to what the delta, what the plug is between what's been authorized and what is actually needed to meet our infrastructure needs in these areas?
Yes, sir. So the 100-year timeline that you've read about, it looks at the roughly the $98 billion backlog of projects where we have a chief's report on the table, but the project has not received funding yet. So that's how we have defined the backlog. With the generous appropriations from Congress of recent years, 6.9, 6.8, almost $7 billion, about $1 billion of that is dedicated to actual construction. So that's the math, $1 billion a year construction against a $100 billion backlog.
Okay, thank you. And help me understand too, when you do the analytics on any of these projects, are you taking into account the impact of climate change and the need for addressing it both in terms of today as well as terms and forecast for future years?
Yes, sir, we do. So the recommendations that we take first to General Semonite and then to Secretary James look at a variety of criteria. As I mentioned earlier, life and public safety, always those projects generally rise to the top of our recommendation. Then we have across the country a number of legal mandates and requirements by court order that we have to fulfill. We have to pursue those projects. Some projects have a national security component to them, generally receive very high priority. And then we get into things like BCRs, economic and environmental returns. And then finally, sir, I would just say what's always high on our list, we want to finish what we start. If Congress has appropriated dollars to begin a project, we want to see it through to completion.
And one last question. Does that mean you believe climate change is real and impacting our infrastructure needs? And that question is to both of you.
I'm a civil engineer. I'm not a scientist, and I'm not a weather forecaster. But I will tell you that we're making every effort, as far as I'm concerned and as far as I know, to build sustainable infrastructure. Now, that means looking at today, Mr. Graves over there, Garrett Graves, mentioned that himself, that we can't look back to the 1930s, and we're not doing that. And the technology is so much better today. We're working with NOAA to try to get rain forecast accurate up to 24 hours, within 24 hours. We're not there yet, but we're working on that. Things like that. Now, that's my perspective on your question.
Yes, sir, briefly. So with regard to climate, I always encourage people to read the National Climate Assessment. You don't have to read the whole thing, but there are portions in there that talk about some of the significant changes in precipitation patterns that we're seeing, particularly in the Midwest, the quantity of events and the volume of rainfall that's falling.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ruda. Mr. LaMalfa, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the panel being here today. Just wanted to point out a couple issues in my area as well as my colleague in the adjacent district here on Yuba River, Feather River. My understanding is General Semonite has finalized the chief's report on the lower Yuba River ecosystem restoration project there. So we are looking forward to that, working with Yuba County Water Agency. They do a lot of great work, and so looking forward to the completion of this study on getting that ecosystem restoration going, which will be helpful for a lot of good reasons. So, and then moving on to the Sutter Basin Feather River West Levee project. Again, these issues they run through both districts, myself and Mr. Garamendi, as these projects go along. We want to see the completion of that on the south half. And so we're glad that, Secretary James, you've been a great supporter of this project, appreciate that a lot. And as well as working with the Sutter Butte Flood Control Agency, which has really been emblematic of what a local agency, when allowed to take over a project that the Corps has overseen, we've gotten some great results, and indeed moved up the timeline on the completion of that in Butte and Sutter counties. What could have been 2024 has saved $300 million and could have been done as soon as 2017, 2019. We should see that project completed in 2020, so that'll be great for the flood control and the public safety of that area. So we'll still be ahead of time and much under budget. So I hope this can be an example we can work on and use in many more projects around the country. What lessons, Secretary James, do you think we've learned from Sutter Butte and the Section 1043 agreements that Army Corps has made on this? And then what do you think as far as cost savings and timelines going forward on, like we've done on this, on future projects? What do you see as, how big of a thing is this for your administration on that?
Well, my thinking on it is that we can save time and we can save money if the project sponsor can afford it. There's not every area in this country that can, but the ones that can and have the expertise. There's areas in this country that need flood control, for example, that there's not a bulldozer or track hoe operator and equipment in their area, even if they had money. So that's what I see. The availability of these authorizations like 1043 are going to be very helpful in a lot of areas of this country, but they won't fit everybody.
At a hearing we had here about a year, maybe a year and a half ago, it was something that some of you and your colleagues had brought up as a model to have a lot more of that under this administration. And so are you seeing that actually is playing out as a model for other areas? Is that being put in place to any widespread?
You mean Sutter, or do we have it?
Well, Sutter, we're almost there, right? Yeah. But in other examples around the country was what the administration...
We've only had two, McCook Reservoir in Chicago and Harris County in Texas. Both sponsors of those projects have engaged 1043 and seem to be very happy with what's happening with them.
Good.
I have heard no complaints about it.
Do you believe, either one of you, that the Corps would have any issue with exempting certain states from NEPA when they have their own already high environmental standards, such as in California, CEQA, which a lot of times outdoes what NEPA requirements are?
Congressman, you just threw me a curveball. I hadn't thought about that.
Okay.
But I'd be happy to talk to you about that.
Yeah, we've seen other examples in different agencies, different issues where they would be willing to relent, on other transportation projects, since CEQA is at least equal or even more restrictive, more.
Well, most of
NEPA,
what the Corps does, as I understand it, is regulated and driven by the law that the Congress passes. And even if the Corps sat here and told you they'd be happy to give up NEPA in X state.
It'd provide for more one-stop shopping, where you have two different entities.
Yeah, but that may not be their decision to make.
Yeah.
The Congress may have already made that decision for them, is what I'm saying.
But the Corps would be willing to go along with that conversation, you believe? I guess we can send you more laws, but...
I would be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would be.
Okay. Because it's all about improving the delivery of projects and cost and time and no need for duplicate effort. Yeah. Okay.
It's worth exploring, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. All right, well, my time's already up. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. LaMalfa.
Chairman.
Mr. Stanton, you're next.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing. Thank you to the outstanding witnesses. I'm a former mayor of Phoenix, and I have seen the great work that the Corps of Engineers has done in my city over many years. I recently introduced legislation to create an environmental assistance program modeled after other Western states in partnership with the Corps of Engineers. Can either witnesses, can you describe the benefits of a Corps environmental infrastructure assistance program, especially the benefits of improving existing water and wastewater infrastructure projects before performance and reliability are compromised, please? Major General.
Yes, sir. I mean, I think this year we're seeing that firsthand with the damages to the levees that I mentioned just south of Omaha between Kansas City. Just to do the initial repairs, not to restore the levee, but just to do the initial repairs, these are $7, $8, $9 million projects just to stop the water from flowing into the farmland.
There are several projects the Corps is involved in along the Salt and Gila River corridors through Phoenix. Two of our late great representatives of Arizona, Senator McCain and Congressman Pastor, were both champions of restoration and development of the Salt River through Phoenix and the entire Valley of the Sun. We now call that project, that legacy project, Rio Reimagine. It pulls together multiple local governments, tribal authorities, Arizona State University, the Corps, and others to revitalize over 50 miles of important river corridor through the Phoenix region. Currently, the Corps has only one Civil Works Projects Manager assigned to the Phoenix office of the LA District, which represents all of Arizona. In my opinion, it's clearly not enough. How does the Corps plan to address staffing needs so that all Corps projects in the state can move forward in a timely and appropriate manner with appropriate staffing levels?
Yes, sir. We'll go back and look at this particular project office. As a general statement, we put people where the work is. On this particular set of projects, my understanding is that the current suite of projects were more upland restoration, not necessarily down on the river where we can apply our aquatic ecosystem restoration authorities. I also understand that we would have to do an additional study of what other AER type projects would be out there, but sir, the workload the workforce would follow the workload.
Tres Rios is a Corps project associated with Rio Reimagine. Its project is partially complete, but we need the Corps to complete a limited reevaluation report, LRR, to raise the Section 902 limit and request additional appropriations to fund it. What's the status of this report, and when does the Corps expect it to be completed?
Yes, sir. So we require a new start decision, a new start authority from Congress before we can initiate that general reevaluation report.
Another important project in Arizona is the completion of the Lower Santa Cruz Flood Control Project in Pinal County, the fastest growing county in the United States. Traditional farming communities like Maricopa, which is incorporated in 2003 with a population of approximately 1,000 residents, is now over 50,000 residents. This growing city sits in the middle of a floodplain. Currently, the draft chief reports is slated to be completed in July 2020 and finalized in 2021. In order to keep this project on an optimal schedule, our aim is to get this project authorized in the 2020 WRDA. Can the Corps accelerate the chief's report to coincide with the WRDA 2020 in order to keep the project on schedule?
Sir, we want to expedite this study and all the remaining studies to make them eligible for WRDA 2020. This particular project, we have some additional consultation we need to do with some tribal members in the area, and then we'll work to expedite this, the completion of this study.
I appreciate that. It's not my district, but it's important to the state of Arizona, and so it's important to my district as well. Let me turn to Rio de Flood Control Project in Flagstaff, also not in my district, but important to the state of Arizona. Lieutenant General Semonite visited Flagstaff and toured the project in October. After his visit, he stated that its completion would be one of his top priorities before the end of his term as chief. It's my understanding that the Los Angeles district has requested the remaining $52 million needed to complete this project. Catastrophic flood will affect more than half of Flagstaff's 75,000 residents, including major parts of its downtown and Northern Arizona University, and could cause $1 billion more in damages. Completion of this project is a top priority for the city. Will you support the district's funding request to complete this important project in the fiscal year 2020 work plan?
Yes, sir. So this will go forward with our recommendation. We'll finish PED. We have the dollars to finish PED this year, and as you had the commitment from General Semonite, we want to finish projects that we start.
I really appreciate that. I'm just about out of time, so I'll yield back, but I have another question about Rio Salado Oeste, another very important project of Phoenix. I'll submit it in writing for the record. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Palmer, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Secretary James, at a hearing on the Oversight Committee last year, I requested a list of outstanding feasibility studies by the Corps, and after waiting nearly 9 months, I received a list of 97 studies. And the thing that concerns me about this is that 36 of those studies are over 5 years long and still ongoing, as far as I can tell. 22 are over 10 years long, 15 are over 16 years long, and 4 of them are 20 years older. And there are others that, for some reason, Merganza down in Louisiana has been being studied since 1992 and apparently spent about $75 million on it. There are a couple of other studies, questions that I raised in that hearing last year. West Shore, which had been studied over 40 years, it's not on the list because it's now under construction. And the Comeet River, there was, since 1983, they'd been studying building a diversion canal from the Comeet River over to the Lily Bayou for flood mitigation in the event of a 100-year, 500-year flood. And it is now under construction, but only after they had a catastrophic flood event. Under WRDA 2014, it limited, in an attempt to reduce the time and cost of these studies, there were limits put on the Corps of 3 years and $3 million. These 5-year and older studies, 36 of them, run over $140 million. Are you aware of that?
I wasn't aware of the number or the amount of money. I am aware of the fact that the Corps that are introducing studies as 3 by 3 by 3 are coming to me for waivers more often than I feel we should be doing that. If it's a 3 by 3 by 3, good. If it's not, don't call it that up front.
Well, the law requires that it's 3 years, $3 million.
Sir?
The WRDA that was passed in 2014 requires 3 years, $3 million. You, in response to a question, by the way, Madam Chairman, 17 of these long-term studies are in California, and 23 of them are New York and New Jersey, 8 of which are related to Sandy. But you responded earlier to a gentleman who asked you a question. You said that you're a civil engineer. I worked for 2 international engineering companies prior to running a think tank. And you and I both know that if we were running an engineering company and we went out for bid on a project and had these kind of results in terms of coming up with a design for a plant or any water system for that matter, we'd be out of business. Would you like to respond to that?
I didn't say I like it.
But I want to know what you're going to do about it.
That's what I work at every day, sir. That's what takes up my time. That's what keeps me up at night. I came here with the understanding and desire to help the Corps change themselves through their processes. If they can get the money, then get it done. And I'm still working on that. Well, as long as I stay here, I will continue to work on that.
Do not take this as an attack against you, sir. I appreciate what you're trying to do, and I appreciate the fact that you're an engineer, because I know you're very linear in your thinking and very analytical. But we're facing some serious situations around the country right now. We heard Representative Boss talk about this. We've heard the chairwoman talk about it. And I think some of the issues that we're dealing with is because the Corps is still studying the problem and not doing the project. And that's what happened in Louisiana. It's going to happen in some other places if the Corps keeps studying and doesn't start building. And I'm not attacking the Corps either. I'm just saying there's issues out there that we need to address, and instead of someone making a career out of a project study, it might be better if we start turning some dirt.
Well, I can read you my opening statement, and just exactly what you said's in it. And that's how I feel about this. I came here. I didn't come here for any other reason.
Well, I appreciate that.
This is what I'm trying to do, sir. And I will offer this. Any ideas, or even if invite me over to your office just to discuss this, I'll be happy to.
Well, I'd be happy to go over the list of projects with you, and I think the members from California and some of these other places that are in harm's way might.
Well, I'd be more interested in your thoughts about the solution rather than seeing the list that hadn't been done right. I'd be happy to discuss that.
I'd be happy to meet with you about it. Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Mr. Espaillat, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank the witnesses for their testimony. This is an important opportunity to talk about the need to invest in water infrastructure, particularly habitat restoration and disaster resiliency. I represent half of Manhattan, surrounded by water, the Hudson River and the Harlem River. And I want to take a few moments to draw your attention to some sites that are incredibly important, not only to my district, but I would say New York City as a whole, as well as the greater metropolitan area. Over the past decades, various work has been done under numerous programs to help clean up the Hudson River, restore habitats, and improve public access to it. The Hudson River now has become a playground for sports, recreation, families, and tourists as well. In an urban area as dense as New York City, it is critically important that residents have opportunities to interact with their natural surrounding. For over the past decades, the Army Corps of Engineers has been conducting various studies within the harbor and the broader Hudson Raritan estuary. Many of this includes ecosystem restoration and fish life buildup, as well as resiliency. The Corps is finishing up its recommendations, which would include nearly 24 projects throughout the region, and I understand the Corps plans to include these projects in the next Chief's report. It is my hope that we are able to get this project authorized in the next Water Resources Development Act. Furthermore, I want to highlight the importance of the ongoing New York City, New Jersey Harbor and Coastal Storm Risk Management Facility Study. Aside from protecting the overall area and harbor from storm surge, the study also looks at smaller projects to protect individual communities that will be impacted by storm surge. During Superstorm Sandy, East Harlem was the most significantly impacted portion of my district, experiencing severe flooding. The bulkhead that protects this neighborhood from further flooding is severely damaged and needs to be immediately repaired. Furthermore, current city controller and former Manhattan Borough President Scott Stringer put together an ambitious proposal to extend the life of the Harlem River shoreline through a number of structural changes and ecosystem development, which will enhance resiliency. I want to also raise two other marsh restoration projects in my district, one of which also includes the initial Hudson Raritan estuaries studies. First is the Inwood Marsh, which is just two blocks away from where I live, located in the northern tip of Manhattan. And the other one is Swindler Cove, just off the Harlem River in northern Manhattan. I believe it is within the Corps' ability to do this under your continuing authorities, and we want you to recommend them for immediate action. I would like to ask if you can look into these projects under your continuing authorities programs, as I believe they will make for restoration of considerable green spaces and waterfront access in a part of my district that could use all the green space it can get. I want to ask Mr. James or Mr. Spellman, can you look into these items as part of your coastal storm risk management study, the first ones that I mentioned regarding East Harlem and both the New York and New Jersey initiative? Is there anything that you're doing now that you could look at regarding making our waterfront in Manhattan stronger and more resilient in preparation for the next storm? And the second question, of course, is can you work on these two smaller projects in the northern tip of Manhattan?
No, sir. The answer to both of those are yes. I don't know what kind of engagement there has been with the district on any of those three projects, but regardless if there has been engagement or not, I think General Spellman can take care of making engagement. May know if there has been.
Well, I look forward to working with you, General Spellman, and these are very important projects for northern tip of Manhattan, East Harlem, New York City, and the tri-state area. Thank you so much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Espaillat. I now recognize Mr. Westerman to introduce the next members for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At this time, I would like to recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Rouser, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, Madam Chairman, for this hearing, and I want to thank our two witnesses for being here. Before I forget, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a validation study for Wrightsville Beach, North Carolina, dated June 2019, and a beach renourishment evaluation report for Carolina Beach, North Carolina, dated June 2019. If no objection, I'd like to insert these for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Secretary, I'm sorry? Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Secretary and General Spellman, Wrightsville Beach, Carolina Beach, real briefly, both have really good cost-benefit ratios. We need to have the Carolina Beach included, that project included in the Chief's report for WRDA 2020. From our standpoint, it looks like that's on time and looking good. From your standpoint, I'm curious what you think.
Sir, as you know, both those draft reports are out for public review. We'll collect up those comments by the end of this month, and then we'll wrap up those reports and have them submitted to the administration.
And then, of course, Wrightsville Beach needs to be included in the director's report for WRDA 2020, just to keep everything on par, on time. I think you were including that particular project in your previous answer, but just want to confirm.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I was.
North Topsail, Surf City. Secretary James, you and I spoke about this some time ago. We had a great conversation, and I know y'all were looking at including it in the work plan last time around. Didn't make it for whatever reason, but I want to stress, this is a critical new start, included, authorized by Congress, and quite frankly, had that been in place prior to Hurricane Florence, we wouldn't have had near the amount of damage there at North Topsail Beach that we had as a result of Florence coming through. So I just want to highlight that. Any comment either one of you might have on that particular project?
Yes, sir. So this is certainly also eligible for the FY19 supplemental funds. We owe the Secretary our recommendations on both projects and investigations by the end of this month, and we're going through that process now.
Thank you. And then the last item I want to touch on, and I'll be very candid with you, I'm quite frustrated. In fact, frustrated may not be the word. I've been right mad. In fact, it's almost led a Southern Baptist to cuss. And that is the Southport No Wake Zone, which was authorized in 2016. It's taken 3 years, still no answer. And my inclination, my instinct is the Corps doesn't want to do it. This is not a divisive issue back home. It's unanimous. The Sheriff's Department, the county commissioners, the town of Southport, everybody. In fact, last week when I'm back home for July the 4th, folks want to talk politics. The number one item that was brought up to me was what in the world's going on with our proposed wake zone here at Southport. How do I answer to that? Where are we?
Tell them the letter's on my desk to you.
Well, is that a good letter or a bad letter?
I think you'll quit cussing.
Well, I can tell you what, if it's a bad letter, you're going to hear about it. This has been a very, very frustrating thing, and I've said this to you privately, and I'll say it publicly. Where's the common sense and where's the common courtesy? This should not be complicated. It should not be complicated. I don't usually get riled up about stuff. I'm a pretty even-tempered fella. But like I said, this one has pushed me to the limits because it's just nonsensical. It needs to get done. We won't, this, as my colleague Mr. Graves said earlier in the hearing, we need you to work to get to a yes, not work to get to a no.
Unfortunately, it wasn't on my desk for 3 years, sir. It's been on my desk a very short period of time, and it will be coming to you with a yes right away.
Thank you, sir. That's all I need to know. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes Ms. Fletcher for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Ranking Member Westerman, Chairwoman Napolitano for holding this important hearing. And I want to thank the witnesses for taking the time to testify this morning. The Army Corps of Engineers has one of the most critically important jobs in the country. Nowhere is that more true than in my district, in Texas's 7th Congressional District, where the Army Corps' investment in the Addicks and Barker reservoirs back in the 1940s has been one of the most critical pieces to the development of the city of Houston and to our protection when it comes to flooding and protecting our infrastructure. So we certainly appreciate the work that the Galveston District has done in particular. And we know that while the Corps often suffers from inadequate budgets when compared to the number of authorized projects, it also seems to us that the process can be slow-moving even when fully supported by Congress. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and the concerns that my constituents have for some of the projects. Secretary James, I understand you've placed a focus on pushing the Corps to operate more efficiently, and as I've heard you say, to move dirt faster. That's certainly something that we're interested in seeing. And I know that the Houston Ship Channel is expecting a chief's report soon. Given the tremendous economic boom that we've seen in the Houston economy and the petrochemical industry, as well as the increasing size of the ships coming through our port, will you agree with me that this is one project where we need to get moving dirt as soon as possible?
Yes, ma'am. I've been to the area. I've seen the industry and the commerce there, the need for more infrastructure, better infrastructure, and I do agree with you 100%.
Thank you. And how can we move faster than the usual route that could take that project to 2030 or beyond? How can we start dredging by 2021?
Let me talk, let General Spellman talk to that. I think he might be more up to date on the schedule, and then I'll address anything after that.
Thank you.
Congress is helping, as is the administration, in helping us move projects from start to finish much more rapidly. And I'll say that we're funding projects to completion. So the example I like to use here is the Herbert Hoover Dike in Florida. With incremental funding, it took us 13 and a half years to get that project to the halfway point. This is a cutoff wall for about 54 miles of dike. 13 and a half years to get to the halfway point. Congress and administration made the decision to fully fund the remainder of that project. It's only going to take us 3 years to get the last 50%. So that is one way that Congress and administration is helping us complete projects faster. And you can apply that same dynamic to projects like the Houston Ship Channel.
Thank you. And can you tell me, I believe the chief's report is expected. What can you commit to doing to ensure that the chief's report is done on time?
So on this particular study, ma'am, I understand it's a non-federal sponsor now that wants to take a pause on this particular chief's report as they want to pursue a locally preferred plan to look at two-way traffic for the entirety of the ship channel. I'm sorry, I don't have those dates in front of me, but I can certainly follow up with you on the details that I have from General Owen.
Thank you. I'd appreciate that. That issue is of great concern to our constituents and through folks throughout the entire Houston region. And I think the other thing that's a challenge, and I hear it from my constituents at town hall meetings and other things, we do have several fully authorized and funded projects ready to go. But obviously, engineering is involved. We want to make the best possible decisions, and we want to be thorough in the analysis. And I'm grateful to the Galveston District in particular. I spent time just last week with Colonel Vail and several members of the staff, and I'm very impressed with the work they're doing. But what can we do to move projects faster when there is a clear benefit? In addition to fully funding, what else can we do to just get these projects moving faster?
I would say the first thing you do is stay fully engaged with whatever district that you're dealing with, because sometimes that engagement slips. We're all busy. Most of the people that you're talking about being sponsors are businessmen. They have plenty to do anyway, but staying engaged is one thing. The other thing is if there's rights of way, or relocations of railroads or lines or whatever, that's important, is that the sponsors engage those other entities that can really hold up projects. I mean, that can be a big holdup. And then, other than that, go engage the appropriators and get the money. That's my guess.
Okay, and I see I have gone over my time. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and the chair now recognizes Representative Babin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate that very much. Thank you, both of you witnesses, for being here. And also thank you, Chairman Napolitano and Ranking Member Westerman, and for convening this very important hearing on our nation's water resources. I'd also like to thank our distinguished witnesses, again, for being here. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank you again for your leadership during and after Hurricane Harvey to ensure my constituents in Texas' 36th district and the great people in the greater Houston and coastal Texas region are adequately protected from catastrophic natural disasters. Unfortunately, the North American rainfall record is in my district. My congressional district is home to 3 highly important civil works projects of great economic benefit to our nation. A project to deepen and widen the Houston Ship Channel, currently undergoing a review by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Also a federally funded project to deepen and widen the Cedar Bayou Navigation Channel, and a federally funded project to deepen and widen the Sabine-Neches Waterway, all of these in my district. I'd like to ask you, Secretary James, first, in regards to the Houston Ship Channel, the draft National Economic Development, or NED plan, recommends improvements and widening for only a portion of the Houston Ship Channel through Galveston Bay, Redfish Island, if you're familiar with it. Port Houston, Houston pilots, and private industry have indicated that a partial widening as proposed will create a bottleneck that compromises safety and efficiency throughout the entire system. What can Congress do? More importantly, what can I do to help you ensure the Chief's report reflects the necessary options and opportunities to address safely and the deepening and widening of the entire Houston Ship Channel, not just part of it, including the long-term maintenance of the locally preferred plan?
Sir, I have visited with the local people that are engaging in trying to get that done in Houston. Frankly, I agree with them. It doesn't make much sense to me to dredge and widen half of a channel and leave the other half not. And furthermore, it doesn't make sense to me that if we're only going to dredge half of it, while we're dredging the outer half rather than from the port out. I'd be happy to talk to you about this further. I've got thoughts about it, and your people have visited me more than once. And I'd really like for us to just sit down and talk about this. I don't think the Corps has any anti-ship channel thoughts whatsoever. I think it's just the way their economics worked out, but I think it ought to be looked at.
Okay, well, I'm very, very happy to hear you say that, because we really do need to have a dialogue, because it just doesn't make a bit of sense to do that.
Yes, sir. Well,
Okay,
if you'll let us know.
Yes, sir. And then would it also be beneficial for the Corps to use economics updated from 2016 and 17 to reflect the federal interest in long-term maintenance? Don't you agree with that?
Yes, sir, I certainly do. Okay. I do, as fast as things are changing, particularly down there. I do.
Thank you. And then General Spellman, Section 902 is a policy that limits the construction cost to 120% of the congressionally authorized total project cost. However, there have been several examples since Word of 2007 where civil works projects that were federally funded and under construction either busted the 902 limit or were so close to the limit that construction was expected to stop unless Congress authorized an increase to the total project cost. A great example is the Savannah Harbor Deepening Project, which required an increase in its total project cost in WRDA 2018. And it's my understanding that the post-authorization change report, basically an economic update, took only 3 months to complete under a process that normally takes 12 to 14 months. And as we see more and more port of waterway deepening and widening projects being federally funded for construction, would you commit to expediting any future post-authorization economic updates to 3 months to avoid any delays in their completion, sir?
Sir, every post-authorization change report is different. You have my commitment that we'll expedite all of these as it becomes necessary.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. And then, Mr. Secretary, would you commit to expediting these reviews as well?
Yes, sir. I'm trying.
All right. Well, I will yield back. That's a good affirmative answer there. Thank you so much.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes Representative Carbajal for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Secretary James and General Spellman, thank you for being here today as we hold our first hearing on the implementation of the Water Resource Development Act, also known as WRDA. I also want to take this opportunity to thank you and the Los Angeles District for the incredible work and support the Army Corps provided to reopening the 101 highway following the tragic Montecito debris flow in my district. Thank you for the great work that you did. As we move forward in developing the next WRDA legislation, I want to raise concern on how the benefit-cost ratio is calculated, also known as BCR. This was an issue also that was raised by my colleague, Representative Lowenthal, previously. I have heard from stakeholders in my district about their frustration on how funding gets allocated. As you are probably aware, construction of the Lower Mission Creek project has been authorized since the year 2000 and was later amended in 2007 to reflect the cost share between the federal and non-federal partners. Despite the project being shovel-ready and our local government having invested over $18 million in non-federal resources, federal resources have not been made available for this project. Currently, the BCR score does not account for the environmental benefits. In your experience, what are some of the recommendations we can look to move a project like this forward? And two, what are the benefits for accounting for environmental impacts in a BCR score?
Sir, I'd like to visit with you personally offline to discuss BCR if that would suit you. Generally, I don't think BCRs are being addressed properly either. There are benefits out there that we're not capturing, particularly in less fortunate areas. We're not capturing those benefits to be able to offset the cost of doing projects, and therefore you wind up like this with a low BCR. Now, I'm not talking about drumming up benefits or anything like that. I'm talking about taking a real look at what we call benefits and how we rack those benefits against the cost-benefit ratio. But I'd love to visit with you more.
Great. Well, I hope to someday get a letter like the one that's on your desk that's going to my colleague, Representative Rouser, as was mentioned earlier, because this is a project that's been overstudied for over 30 years. Stakeholders are all on board. There's no dissent on this project. And what's at stake here is real flooding that could take life and property and pretty much with a huge amount of risk. So I look forward to talking to you offline. And again, I look forward to really making some progress on this important issue. So thank you very much, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes Representative Mitchell for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the committee allowing me to participate today. Gentlemen, as you both know, I'm from Michigan, the Great Lakes state. I'm going to try and transport you to the Great Lakes. This time of year, it's a great place to be, and there's no ice, so good news. We only have 5 minutes, so I want to pursue a couple of questions and hopefully get some brief answers, and we can talk offline if needed. Finally, the SULACs are underway, the progress on that after being authorized 31 years ago. I suggest to my colleague down the way that sometimes patience is a virtue, hang in there. It's been approved by the Army Corps after 31 years. It's underway in terms of the initial construction. As you all know, it's a vital link to commerce, and there were some national security concerns because of moving taconite and things to the SULACs. I get regular updates from the Detroit District, which I really appreciate, Joe. It's very helpful. Can you both update me what the next steps are and if we're on track in terms of the progress for had that becoming operational? Can you give us an update on that, please?
Yes, sir. General statement, we are on track. So just a few updates. The design of the upstream channel, sir, that's in progress, and we will award that construction contract before the end of this fiscal year. The designs of the upstream approach walls and the new lock chamber, those are also in progress. We'll award the upstream approach wall construction contract next fiscal year, and we've asked for $75.3 million in the President's budget request for fiscal year 20 to advance those efforts. But we are where we need to be, sir.
And I have, be assured, I have had conversations with the White House administration about ensuring that that funding is part of their requests, and received assurances, in fact, that it will continue to be on the top of their list to continue that construction. So if you heard anything otherwise, let me know so I can go, not curse, but maybe express my, so I think we're in good shape on that. Is there anything else here in Congress you need from us to support that other than ensuring that appropriation continues at the levels you need to move forward?
No, sir, we're getting all the support that we need from a technical perspective to advance the construction in the right sequence.
What's the target date in your mind for the additional lock to become operational?
Sir, I'd like to follow up with you after that.
It's one of those. Okay. I'd be happy to do that. I'm happy to schedule that if you can. Let's move ourselves off to the world of Asian carp and the Brandon Road, Lock and Road project, which is a critical issue for the Great Lakes region, for the basin. As you all know, that's the last stopping point for the spread of Asian carp into the Great Lakes basin and the damaged ecosystem that would do. The feasibility study was completed. Can you highlight some of the findings that were in the chief's report and where we plan on moving forward?
Yes, sir. So General Semonite did sign the chief's report, as you know, and that's now with the secretary for the administration's review. Sir, we understand the concerns that we're hearing from the field on the cost, and there are really two drivers for that. First, we have a high contingency because we're dealing with some new technology on these fish barriers, and we are confident that we can drive that contingency down as we get into preliminary engineering and design. That was the first driver. The second driver was the addition of the concrete channel from the previous report, and we believe that concrete channel is important for this particular project because that's what's going to provide the best efficacy for these new technologies on this particular barrier.
I have heard some concerns about the non-federal partner and, frankly, their ability to participate as we need them in this. What I suggested and is being pursued, so you know, is whether or not we look at a non-federal partner to be the Great Lakes Compact, to look at approaching it in that manner, because there's been some concern about whether or not the state of Illinois will support the effort. Do you guys have any opinion on that?
I don't think I'll give you an opinion on what you should do, sir. But I can tell you that since before this even started in earnest, the state of Illinois, which almost has to be the sponsor because it's in that state, et cetera, has, I won't say waffled, but they really can't make up their mind whether they want to engage as the sponsor or not. For the term that they decided to engage as a sponsor, it looked pretty simple to me to have a meeting and all the states agreed how much they were going to kick in on it and all that. but I hear there's trouble again.
Well, we're engaging on that issue, just so you know, because it is critically important. If we could, one comment, I'd like to schedule offline, because there's not enough time here to talk about the fairly historic Great Lakes levels, the impact it's having in terms of flooding, and some of the flood maps that you folks are talking about versus, so that's a longer conversation, and 5 minutes will enable us, but if we could schedule it in my office, I'd like to follow up on that, because obviously we're seeing some historic flooding in the Great Lakes Basin.
I think you've got a commitment from both of us to do that, but I don't know why I think there's 32 or so on this committee. Over half would need to sit down and talk about the same thing, flooding.
Well, at least it implies at least you have a full-time gig right now, so I appreciate your time and your collective commitment to serve. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I would like to personally thank the chairwoman for trusting me with meaningful work during the committee, and I yield back to the chairman.
The chair recognizes herself, and I'd like to recognize Ms. Evie Johnson.
Thank you very much, and let me express my appreciation to both of you for holding this hearing, and thanks to the witnesses for being present. On this past Monday, I held a bipartisan regional roundtable discussion in my district to tackle the critical issue of flooding, flood prevention, and flood control. We had federal, state, regional, and local stakeholders who participated in a rather lively discussion. And during the roundtable, it was explained how $100 billion in flood damage was prevented by spending $2 to $3 billion annually on a flood control system. And it was clear that issues of flooding, flood prevention, and flood control must be addressed regionally using cross-functional teams with stakeholders at all levels of government and working together. So my question, and let me precede that by saying that we've had great cooperation with the Corps in that area. I'm from Dallas, Texas, not the coastal area of Houston. But how can the Corps develop national programs that focus on preventing flooding rather than just being reactive and responding to flooding? That's one question. The second one is, how can the Corps share information of flooded areas with navigation technology, provide us to reroute drivers away from flooded roads and highways? And the third one, and maybe you can, both of you can address all three, does the Corps have the authority it needs to address stormwater runoff, filtering stormwater, and recharge aquifers? I hope I didn't overwhelm you with all three questions at one time.
You almost did. No, ma'am. I'll take the prevent flooding one. I agree with you 100%. $1 prevention is worth $10 of fixing, and I agree with you 100%. Now, the only thing that keeps us from doing that is the authorization and the appropriation of money, both in the president's budget and by the Congress. And we realize it, and our people like yourself out in these communities bring to us the reasons we need flood control here. We need it. Okay, so we realize it, the Corps goes back, looks at it, but then getting it from there to a product, it's hard, and it's getting harder all the time. Now, when a storm hits and washes away everything you've got, then people are willing to jump in and help you then that weren't willing to help you prevent that flooding. So that's where we are. And, you know, as we take what money we can get as a Corps of Engineers and spread it as thin as we can. Although I think General Spellman mentioned just a few minutes ago, we're trying to complete projects with what money we get before starting another project. Now, there's an argument there, whether we ought to be doing that or not. And, you know, so I hope I didn't confuse you.
Ma'am, I would only add to what the Secretary said, but just humbly a little historical perspective. I mentioned in my opening statement that the nation's experiencing its wettest year on record, at least east of the Mississippi, in over 124 years. And the nation, Congress, and the administration have, over generations, invested in flood control. Because if this year's event happened 100 years ago, we've had those type of floods, and hundreds of people have died. I mean, there are mass graves in this country that bury the dead from flood events. We had some deaths this year, but not in the hundreds, certainly not in the thousands. So now it's getting this infrastructure ready for the next generation, and all that we are seeing with changes in precipitation and sea level rise. And in Corps, we're committed to do our part within all of our authorities to advance this infrastructure to get it ready for the next generations that follow us.
Well, thank you very much. My time is about out, but what do we have to do to encourage a bit more focus on prevention? Does it mean legislative authority?
On prevention of flooding? I think we've got a lot of authorities in general, but on particular projects, they have to go through the system. They have to have an authorization, and then they have to have the environmental work done on it, have to get a chief's report, and finally come back to the Congress for appropriations or be put into the president's budget. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. My time's expired.
The gentlelady yields back. Lots of members have wanted a second run at it, but we don't have enough time. And I thank you for your patience. Some housekeeping questions. Mr. Secretary, Congress directed the court to solicit projects and study requests from local sponsors and issue a report to Congress through Section 7001 of WRDA. And as you know, the 2019 report was 5 months late. Can you commit that 2020 report under development will be delivered on time in February 2020 to be used to formulate WRDA 2020?
Yes, ma'am, my fault. I'll take care of it.
Thank you for your commitment, and you heard it. Can you also provide to the subcommittee the following: a brief summary of the eight chiefs report, 8 of them, already submitted to Congress for authorization, and any known post-authorization change reports needing congressional action? You can provide it for the record.
Yes, ma'am. You have our commitment. We'll have those ready in time for the next order bill.
Thank you for your commitment. And thank you very much. It's been almost 2.5 hours, and I thank you for your patience. And we are now concluding this portion of the meeting. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any additional comments and questions may be submitted for the record, and they'll go to you. Now we will proceed to hear from the next panel. Thank you for being here. All of you, welcome. Thank you for your patience. You heard there's quite a bit of interest in the Army Corps testimony. For panel 2, we have Mr. Rob Innes, Sparrows Point, Maryland, Plant Manager, Lafarge and Olson, on behalf of Waterways Council. We have Mr. Chad Berginis, Executive Director, Association of State Floodplain Managers. Then we have Mr. Tom Waters, Chairman, Missouri Levee and Drainage District Association. Then followed by Ms. Julie Hill Gabriel, Vice President for Water Conservation, the National Audubon Society. Then we have Mr. Derek Brockman, Executive Director, American Shore and Beach Preservation Association. And finally, Dr. F. Martin Ralph, Director of Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes, Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego. And without objections, your prepared statements will be entered into the record. Mr. Innes, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano, Ranking Member Westerman, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My testimony will focus on the importance of the Inland Waterway Transportation System. I currently serve as the plant manager of Sparrows Point Slag Cement Facility in Baltimore, Maryland for Lafarge-Holcim. Lafarge-Holcim produces cement, aggregates, concrete, and specialty construction solution products used in building projects ranging from affordable housing to small, local projects to the largest, most technically and architecturally challenging infrastructure projects. We operate in more than 80 countries with over 80,000 employees. We currently operate 30 facilities along the river system, and in 2018, moved 9.2 million tons by river. If we were to move this tonnage by truck, it would equate to 368,000 more trucks on the road. I'm also a board member of the Waterways Council and an executive committee member. WCI is a national public organization that advocates for the modern, well-maintained system of the inland waterways and ports. Recently, I also became chairman of the Inland Waterways User Board. When thinking of the transportation infrastructure, the inland waterways system is often overlooked. Our rivers are the fourth R of the critical multimodal system of roads, railway, and runways. In 2017, more than 578 million tons valued at $220 billion were transported on the inland waterway system. Of that tonnage, almost 80 million tons were aggregates, which is 14% of the total tonnage moved along the inland waterway system. Some aggregates and cement projects sourced from the river that benefits America included the new terminal complex at the Louis Armstrong Airport, the Amazon Distribution Center in Minneapolis, and the I-90 tollway rebuild from Chicago to Milwaukee. After only passing 2 WRDA bills in 14 years, this committee, starting in the 113th Congress, made WRDA a priority, passing 3 bills in 6 years. I would like to thank the committee for implementing the changes in the WRDA 2014 that have significantly accelerated the project delivery in the inland waterway system. A cost share change at Olmsted Lock and Dam allowed for the Inland Waterways Trust Fund to operate over the last 6 years at a 25% trust fund, 75% general fund split. This cost share change has also accelerated the operability of Olmsted, allowing for over $600 million in annual economic benefit to be accrued 4 years ahead of schedule. Also enacted in 2014 and taking effect in 2015, the Inland Waterways industry supported a 45% tax increase to the diesel tax commercial operators pay that is deposited into the Inland Waterways Trust Fund. This is currently the highest federal fuel tax being paid by any mode of transportation. In WRDA 2016, Congress changed the cost share model for funding the deep draft ports with depths of 45 to 50 feet from 50% non-federal sponsor to 50% federal government to 25% non-federal sponsor to 75% government in order to allow the ports to expeditiously expand capacity to become post-Panamax vessel ready. This was necessary to enable our ports to remain competitive on a global scale. In WRDA 2007, this committee created the Navigation Ecosystem Sustainability Program, NESS, as an innovative effort combining 2 of the Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works key missions, navigation and ecosystem restoration. This program was studied for 13 years at a cost of $74 million. Upon completion of the feasibility study, the Corps of Engineers moved directly to pre-construction engineering and design, PED, for 7 years, spending $62 million before being abruptly halted. It is discouraging that a project that has already seen $136 million in 21 years of time invested was halted. Waterways users, including my company, would like to see the Corps immediately restart PED. We foresee construction funding becoming available soon. However, without PED, NESP will not be ready to receive those funds. The Inland Waterways System has a portfolio of more than 15 high-priority inland navigation projects, either under construction or awaiting construction. At the current rate, many of these projects will not even begin construction for the next 20 years. By conforming the cost share of the Inland Waterways Trust Fund to the same formula that was approved for the deep draft ports in WRDA 2016, this committee's actions would allow the Navigation Capital Program to remain operating at or above $400 million level achieved since the cost share change at Olmsted, and accelerate project delivery on the portfolio of the critical inland waterways projects. As you move forward with WRDA 2020 and any potential infrastructure bill, I encourage you to consider the proposal to adjust the cost share for the construction of the inland waterways infrastructure projects. This is an important change that will help advance our nation's competitiveness, keep America leading at the top. That concludes my testimony, Madam Chair. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today, and I'd be happy to respond to any questions you or other committee members have.
Thank you, Mr. Innes. Mr. Burginis, you're next.
Good afternoon,
Good
Chairwoman Napolitano and Ranking Member Westerman. I'm Chad Burginis, Executive Director of the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and I'm honored to be here today. As we contemplate the most recent round of flooding and the damages that have been caused in the central U.S., in our coastal areas, and even as the result of the failure or near failure of flood control structures like Oroville Dam, we must recognize that as a nation, our current approach is being outpaced by rising seas, more intense rainfall events, and skyrocketing flood damages. Our members are on the front lines of this battle for decades, and we've advocated for sensible policies to reduce flood damages and recognize natural functions of floodplains. Our written testimony contains over 20 recommendations, and we'd like to highlight a few of those today. First, we need a coherent flood management policy to complement our flood control efforts. Among those identified in our testimony, 3 critical ones are making room for our rivers and setting levees and other flood control structures back, harnessing the benefits of natural infrastructure, and using non-structural measures wherever possible, whenever and wherever structural measures are contemplated. Throughout Corps programs guidance, there is a systematic bias towards structural projects and again, non-structural projects. We must ensure that federal programs like PL 8499 not only require the analysis of such options, but establish a preference for them. Second, guidance documents like principles and guidelines that steer solutions toward those that maximize national economic development need to be replaced by guidance that prioritizes national economic resiliency and sustainability. We need to complement national studies, or complete national studies such as those authorized under Section 2032 of the 2007 WRDA, which analyzes the nation's vulnerability to flooding. We must also ensure that regional studies that are being done for such areas such as the southeastern and Gulf Coast, and even those that are called for on the Missouri, are fully inclusive of all flood loss reduction tools, including non-structural. Third, we believe that there should be organizational changes in the Corps that unlocks the massive knowledge and expertise of its staff for the benefits of the Corps itself and all communities by making technical assistance a top priority. Today's reality is that the Corps employees cannot even lead local workshops without some specific project to pay for it. There were lots of comments earlier today about how the Corps can leverage the expertise, especially in small and rural communities. This is one way to do that. Internally within the Corps, there are centers of expertise like the National Non-Structural Committee, whose role is to advise both internal customers and Corps districts, but also communities and the general public. But these are so under-resourced that they can serve neither very well. This also means that we leverage the good research and development that is being done by the Corps and ensure that it is adopted throughout the agency and disseminated to the public. For example, the Engineering with Nature initiative uses natural processes and systems in concert with engineered systems to produce a more diverse array of economic, environmental, and social benefits. ASFPM hopes that it is adopted widely within the Corps. In a unique public-private partnership with ASFPM and FM Approvals, the National Flood Barrier Testing and Certification Program helps develop and use consensus standards for flood abatement products. But in the 5 years since the standard has been in existence, we have yet to see the Corps include the standards in its policies, procedures, or contracts for flood fighting materials agency-wide. We note that some of the flood fighting products that were used and failed in Iowa this past spring were not certified. Finally, we must vastly improve how we communicate flood risk. Over the last decade, we have seen the creation and availability of online databases like the National Inventory of Dams and National Levee Database, and these are very promising developments, but they are missing critical information. None is more pressing than the information we have chosen to withhold from the public. Inundation mapping where flood control structures are operational or where they fail. Since 9/11, this information has been categorized as for official use only, yet when we have incidents like the near catastrophic event at Oroville Dam in California or the Barker and Addicks reservoirs in Texas, it is unacceptable that tens of thousands of people in harm's way are aware of their flood risk. I hope that these observations and recommendations help better inform your work on the next WRDA, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beginnis. Mr. Tom Waters, you recognize.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, members of the committee, and I want to include staff too. I appreciate this opportunity to provide testimony regarding the Water Resources Development Act and the Missouri River. As chairman of the Missouri Levee and Drainage District Association, I represent levee and drainage districts, businesses, associations, and individuals interested in the activities and issues surrounding the Missouri River and its tributaries. I'm honored to have this opportunity to provide comments on behalf of Levee Association's membership and fellow Missourians who have been impacted by this year's flooding. I'm a seventh-generation farmer. I produce corn, soybeans, and wheat on the highly productive bottomlands along the Missouri River. I know and understand the importance levees and flood control projects play in protecting lives and property in my community and communities across the nation. Now, I could read 17 pages of testimony, but I don't think you want me to do that, and I don't want to do that. So I'd rather just make 3 points this afternoon. First, the current Missouri River flooding is not over. The reservoirs in the upper basin in Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota are full. Reservoirs in Kansas have an abundance of water, and reservoirs in Missouri and in the Osage Basin are full as well. Now, all 3 of these basins are going to flow water down the Missouri River, and it's got to get to St. Louis by the next spring. So that's going to keep the river high. We know it's going to be high above flood stage probably through the rest of this summer, fall, and into winter. And with over 100 levees breached along the Missouri River, flooding is going to continue to be a problem. It's going to take a long time to recover these levees, and it's going to take funding. I hope this committee and Congress will act quickly and decisively to push the Corps forward with funding and oversight so repairs can be made as soon as possible. My second point, flood control needs to be the #1 priority for the Missouri River Reservoir system. This was a once highly engineered system, but over the past 20 years, it's been used to conduct supersized science experiments for 2 birds and a fish. These experiments have decimated the flood control system. Dike notching destroyed dikes, revetments, and other structures in the river. Open channels and chutes along the river have caused the river to flow differently than it used to. Changes in storage levels, changes in how and why we release water, all have changed and taken away from flood control in the system. We have to get back to flood control as the top priority. We've reached a tipping point, and we can no longer continue to conduct failed experiment after failed experiment at the expense of people's lives and livelihoods. And I said lives because people have died. Missouri and Iowa farmland was not meant to be the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service laboratory, and Midwestern farmers no longer want to be their guinea pigs. Brings me to my third point, and that's that it's not just the Missouri River. Flood control infrastructure needs to be a national priority. Just like the highway system, the power grid, internet, and communications infrastructure, flood control infrastructure has been left behind. Flooding takes place in nearly every day in this country somewhere. Just look at your TV every morning, you can see it's flooding somewhere, most recently the day before yesterday here in Washington. We spend billions of dollars in flood recovery, and in comparison, we spend very little on prevention. And we can't build an umbrella over the coastlines to protect us from hurricanes, and we can't bolt together the fault lines to protect us from the earthquakes. But we can build flood control infrastructure. Floods do not discriminate. They don't choose Democrats over Republicans. They don't choose rich over poor, east over west, or north over south. Flood control is not a partisan issue. It's an issue impacting the entire country, and as such, the entire Congress should support prioritizing flood control infrastructure as money is spent for infrastructure projects is appropriated. I thank you, and I ask that my written comments be included in the record, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Waters. Now, Chair recognizes Ms. Julie Hill-Gabriel.
Chairwoman Napolitano, Ranking Member Westerman, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm Julie Hill-Gabriel, the Vice President for Water Conservation at the National Audubon Society. And on behalf of our more than 1 million members, 23 state offices, and over 400 independent local chapters, Audubon's mission is to protect birds and the places they need for today and tomorrow. Just like people, birds need water. And because of that, Audubon has made water conservation a core part of our conservation strategy. We work in places that are globally significant for birds and people, like the Colorado River and network of saline lakes in the arid West, like the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River and its delta, the Gulf Coast, the Delaware River, the Everglades, and the Platte River, among many other places. And aquatic ecosystems are really the liquid heart of America's environment. They provide drinking water for hundreds of millions of people, while also showing innumerable benefits for wildlife and our nation's economy. As we discuss implementation of past Water Resources Development Acts and look ahead to future legislation regarding water infrastructure, it's critical to prioritize the investments in the aquatic ecosystem mission of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. One international model of success for ecosystem restoration can be found in America's Everglades. It truly is the nonpartisan issue in the state of Florida, where you have local, state, and federal decision makers all acknowledging the benefits of restoration efforts, not only for the wildlife that made the Everglades famous, but for addressing issues like the toxic blue-green algae blooms, red tide, and seagrass die-off that have plagued Florida's coast in recent years. And the economic consequences of these environmental catastrophes have truly demonstrated the inextricable link between the environment and the economy. And Everglades projects are estimated to produce a 4-to-1 return on investment. Now, equally important are projects like those along the coast of Louisiana and the Mississippi River Delta, where Audubon has owned and managed over 26,000 acres for almost a century. A recent study by Audubon and our partners showed that the coast of Louisiana is one of the most important places in the world for wildlife habitat, some species having 50% of their population using the coast for nesting and breeding habitat. The restoration and protection of the Mississippi River Delta is often advanced through WRDA legislation and is essential to keeping this important ecosystem from collapse. Now, the recent success and momentum on ecosystem restoration efforts can largely be credited to the work of this committee, getting us back on track with passing WRDA bills every other year has enabled us to see significant progress and see some of these ecosystem projects now become a reality. In addition to advancing critical ecosystem restoration projects, provisions in WRDA 16 and 18 present important opportunities to incorporate the use of more resilient natural infrastructure options to reduce the impacts of storms, flooding, or coastal erosion, and to promote reliable water supply. These can include nature-based options like restoring sand dunes, wetlands, oyster reefs, and coastal forests, and they can be used in place of or alongside traditional infrastructure like seawalls, jetties, and levees. In 2018, Audubon released a natural infrastructure report that highlighted the benefits of a number of projects, from sediment diversions in Louisiana to living shorelines in California and North Carolina to restoring breakwater oyster reef habitat in Florida. And all of these showed the significant benefits of this type of infrastructure. When looking for options to reduce the impact of storms, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has found that across the U.S., Coastal wetlands are estimated to provide more than $23 billion in storm protection services every year. And in watersheds that contain 15% wetlands, peak floods can be reduced by up to 60%. Despite the clear statutory language in recent WRDA bills directing the Army Corps to consider natural infrastructure alternatives, very few of these measures are being implemented. More effort is needed to ensure that the Army Corps can capture the multiple benefits provided by these measures and to require the Corps to conduct a full evaluation of a natural infrastructure alternative in each study addressing flood and storm damage reduction. Audubon stands ready to work with the Army Corps and the subcommittee and other partners to find innovative and efficient ways to advance water infrastructure and help protect birds in the places they need. Thank you for allowing me to be here today, because we truly believe that where birds thrive, people prosper.
Thank you, Ms. Julie Hill Gabriel, for your testimony. And we now turn to Mr. Derek Brockman. You're recognized.
Thank you. America has an engineered shoreline. Nearly every beach on the East and Gulf Coast and many on the Pacific and Great Lakes coasts have been restored, renourished, and re-engineered to mimic natural systems. And estuarine systems from Louisiana to San Francisco Bay are engineered, either armored with bulkheads and riprap, or preferably with natural infrastructure such as restored wetlands and living shorelines. What connects our shorelines is the need for sand and sediment. Sand and sediment are the building blocks of a healthy coastline. Beaches and wetlands are dynamic systems that should naturally be eroding and rebuilding, but too often they cannot rebuild because we have prevented sediment from ever reaching the coasts. Levees prevent flooding and sediment deposition. Hardened cliffs, riverbanks, and dams keep sediment out of waterways, and jetties and dredging send sediment far offshore. We are facing a coastal sediment crisis, and that's before we consider the challenges of rising sea levels and localized subsidence. American Shore and Beach Preservation Association has been working with the Army Corps of Engineers for nearly 100 years to merge science and policy to protect, restore, and enhance our nation's coastlines. We are an organization of beach and coastal practitioners. We're the communities, industry, local elected officials, and academics who build, maintain, manage, and research our nation's beaches and shorelines. Thank you for inviting us to speak here today. We believe the most fundamental thing the Army Corps can do to better manage coastlines is operate under principles of regional sediment management, or RSM. This is a concept that sediment is a resource, not a waste product, and managing sediment within a watershed or littoral system, not a project-by-project basis, is more ecologically sound and saves money. In short, we need to move sediment within a system, not remove it. RSM goes well beyond just reusing dredge material, but an important part of RSM is beneficial reuse. The Corps dredges about 214 million cubic yards of sediment per year from navigation channels. Of that, about 38% is used beneficially. And while hitting 380 might get a baseball player into the All-Star game, the Corps should strive to bat 1,000 and beneficially use 100% of uncontaminated dredge material. The Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has long sought to support RSM in beneficial use. WRDA 2016, Section 1122, has proven to be tremendously popular with local communities. Last year, in the span of a month, 94 projects were submitted to be one of the first 10 beneficial use of dredge material pilot projects. After some delays, the Corps can and should implement and highlight these projects as beacons of what can happen when feds and locals work together to manage a scarce resource. But beneficial use must be systemic across the Army Corps. One way to do this is to change the understanding of the federal standard. As part of the Army Corps' determination of the least cost alternative for the disposal of dredge material, the Corps should include the economic evaluation of sand, including potential ecosystem restoration benefits, storm damage reduction benefits, and other economic values and long-term costs. The next fundamental way to improve coastal project development and prioritization is modifying the Corps' benefit-cost ratio process, the BCR process. BCRs ensure that the federal taxpayer only pay for projects that provide positive economic benefits. However, in designating a project authorized as flood risk reduction or coastal storm risk reduction, the Corps will only calculate benefits derived from reducing flood risk. So that project will not be designed to support other benefits, such as habitat or the economy. Furthermore, a project that does have multiple benefits must compete for federal dollars with no advantage against projects that have a single benefit. In the case of beaches, the economic value can be remarkably high. Economist Dr. James Houston has calculated that beach travel and tourism generates $285 billion to the national economy and $23 billion in federal tax revenue annually. These type of economic figures ought to be considered when deciding which flood risk management projects to prioritize. WRDA 2018 did authorize a National Academies and a GAO study to look at Army Corps budgeting practices, and these studies will help inform the Corps BCR process, but by themselves they don't actually change anything. The Corps BCR for flood risk management projects is an archaic tool that needs to be modernized. Congress needs to direct the Corps to update its BCR process, either to consider the full array of benefits or to develop a new methodology for prioritization that incorporates a project's secondary benefits. The result of advancing RSM and beneficial use and reforming the Corps' BCR will be improved decision-making framework that appropriately values natural infrastructure, the beaches, dunes, and wetlands that provide flood risk reduction, but so much more. Army Corps mandates are too broad and the challenges of the coast too great for the Corps to continue to focus on projects that only solve one problem at a time. Natural infrastructure provides flood risk benefits, ecological benefits, economic and recreation benefits. The Corps has been building beaches for 100 years and restoring wetlands for 50 years, so the concept of natural infrastructure is not new. The next step is for the Corps to maximize multiple benefits for individual projects and within coastal systems. Finally, the needs of our nation's coastlines are too enormous to be solved by policy changes and authorized projects in WRDA alone. Our country must make major investment in infrastructure that includes dedicated support for coastal resilience and natural infrastructure. ASBPA looks forward to working with the T&I Committee to address these challenges in WRDA and any future infrastructure legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brockman. We now recognize Dr. F. Martin Ralph. Welcome.
Good day. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, Chairwoman Napolitano and Ranking Member Westerman and the committee. I'm here to describe an experience we're gaining on bringing weather forecast information into reservoir operations. It's an experimental effort. It's being done in very close collaboration with the Corps of Engineers and with local water agencies on the West Coast. We've brought scientists together in meteorology, in hydrology, in biology, with civil engineers in water management, flood control, and the like, to explore how this might work in the future. Traditionally, forecast information on precipitation has not been able to be used directly in reservoir operations because historically the skill has been extremely low. But one of the great accomplishments of science in our lifetimes has been the development of weather prediction that has some skill. We've come to realize through those studies in the last several years that certain types of storms that affect the West Coast, we now know as atmospheric rivers, have some predictive skill. So let me take you to a time a few years ago with a reservoir in Northern California on the Russian River, Lake Mendocino, and it was December, and a big atmospheric river had started to refill the reservoir a bit to where it should be. Another one hit a few days later, encroached into the flood pool, and possibility was there for another one to come. As the rules require for this operation, that reservoir was 25,000 acre feet was released to restore the flood control pool. That flood control pool was then available if another storm had come, just as the rules had designed it to be. As a meteorologist, I would say facing two ARs that had just hit and another one, if it were to hit, would be a serious problem. I think it was a smart move. However, what happened, and nobody could predict this at the time, was the drought began, the worst drought on record in the area. The reservoir then declined over the next 13 months to its lowest point in a long time. And that created a bit of an issue for water supply, not only for the people, but for agriculture, and also for an endangered species there. Salmon are a serious issue. There's a biological opinion on this river, and the agencies that are responsible work very hard to try to keep that salmon alive. So the Sonoma Water Agency, the Army Corps of Engineers, and a group of scientists led by myself and the chief engineer of Sonoma Water got together a group to explore the possibility, hey, we've seen this atmospheric river phenomena develop in our science. We think there's predictability there. Is it possible that there's enough skill there that in that case in 2012, operators could have looked ahead several days and realized there's no AR coming. Let's save some of that water, pending the next day's forecast and whether or not there'll be more storms coming enough to be concerned or not. One of the special situations in this region of the world is atmospheric rivers are the driver of flood. So from a weather standpoint, our challenge about looking ahead boils down to we really don't care about the run-of-the-mill storms. We care about these atmospheric rivers. There's only a few each year, and they make or break the water year for much of the West. They also can produce very beneficial precipitation in the case like in 2012, but then if it went too far, it creates a flood. All right, so we got this team together to develop this work plan to decide if we could do a paper study. We had the Army Corps of Engineers fully represented on the committee, as well as the operator of the dam for water supply. So the operators were at the table. We had scientists from hydrology, meteorology, and others, together with NOAA, Army Corps of USGS, the Bureau of Reclamation, and others who have expertise. And we just had we developed a collaborative framework and developed a work plan that we agreed upon to proceed over the next several years to do a paper study. What we discovered in the first 2 or 3 years was that it looks very promising. So promising, in fact, that we were requested as a committee to submit a major deviation request. That was reviewed, approved, and now the reservoir was operated this last winter under this major deviation very successfully. Fantastic example of the Corps working well with its partners and with scientists to develop new opportunities. This has now led to additional studies in Southern California, very different environment, and in Northern California. Each watershed is different, the weather is different, the climatology is different, the operating circumstances differ, and we're trying to take a look at this new method in these other areas in a systematic way to try to explore the potential of it. Our committee believes that there's possibility for this to be broadly applicable, but we've also come to recognize that in my own naive, non-hydrologist way, every reservoir is like a person. It's got its own personality. Assuming what we find from one is going to apply to every other one is really not valid. So we're taking and developing a very systematic approach in close collaboration with water agencies that have to deliver water to customers and the Army Corps of Engineers who often cooperate the reservoir in some fashion with our scientists and the ecosystem experts to understand whether we can bring weather information in a more reliable way to support water operations.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. That sounds very promising, and I hope that you develop it further to help anywhere in the United States eventually. Thank you, everybody, for your testimony. We will recognize myself for 5 minutes, and the questions that I have were many, and I think we'll try to expedite this since we've been here almost 3 hours. Mr. Virginis, this year's floods have devastated communities across the nation. How do we help ensure that the Corps helps to rebuild? How we build it better? Do you think the funding is sufficient to do so?
I do not think the funding is sufficient. And again, as outlined in our testimony, and it was very interesting to hear the comments about how we can bring this to bear on all communities, right? Not just in communities with authorized projects. And the Corps has so much expertise, but it is unable physically to go out into communities to help with planning and doing projects, even projects where a community might want to do it themselves. So that's one aspect of it. The other is, you know, I was reading about a report that came out, I think in the last week or so, that used the example of if we use the option of seawalls, that across the nation we're looking at about a $400 billion price tag when it comes to dealing with sea level rise. And the intent of that study was not to say we need seawalls everywhere, but the intent of that study was to start getting our arms around the magnitude of the flooding problem that we face with the future conditions that we're going to be dealing with. And so the $100 billion backlog that we talk about is really small compared to just what we're going to be facing on our coasts.
Mr. Brockbank and Ms. Hill Gabriel, we hear more of the reports of coastal beach closure because of the algae bloom. What is the ecological and economic consequences of algae blooms? What are your recommendations for long-term solutions? How does it affect communities and tourism and fishing and the lost revenue?
Certainly the economics of algae bloom are devastating to local communities who rely on beach tourism as a primary source of their economic well-being. ASBPA doesn't work on water quality issues, but we are very actively trying to support these communities that have economic base, beach tourism economic base. And so I think whatever the Corps is able to do to ensure that the water quality is of a sufficient standard to maintain that base, is absolutely critical.
And thank you for that question. I think another important factor to think about is the need to coordinate between local government, state government, and the federal government. There are many things that are outside of the Army Corps' mission that they do not have control over that often contribute to the algae blooms. So looking at where, for example, there are state water quality issues that need to be addressed that end up having a confluence with the water management issues that the Army Corps is responsible for, we have to look at these things comprehensively. Almost in every case where we see a massive algal bloom problem, there's not one silver bullet solution. So ensuring that we bring the right people together to talk about each different decision maker or entity's responsibility in trying to address the problem is critically important. And I just have to share that, I saw Congressman Mast put up the pictures of the algal bloom in the St. Lucie estuary in Florida. And I remember that about 3 years ago, I went when it was particularly bad and went out there for the first time. I lived in Florida at the time, but not right there. And I parked my car and I opened the door and I was across the street from the water. And I thought, oh, I must have parked next to a dumpster. I was not parked next to a dumpster. This is something that, so far away, the smell was just really overcomes you, and it truly is something that you physically feel in your eyes, and it immediately makes it challenging. So, of course, people are not going to want to come to these destinations that are, world-renowned tourist destinations when that's the impacts that they're feeling. And so the economic damages that occur as a result of that are clear.
Well, do you find that the agencies don't always talk to each other? Because when I was in state government, I had to bring them together to talk to each other and cooperate with each other, but doesn't that sound like it would be the norm?
I think we wish it would, but that's certainly always a challenge, is a need for someone to take a leadership helm and make sure that those people are brought together to the table at the right time to have the right discussion, and that everyone is willing and ready to address their contribution to the problem.
Dr. Martin, one of the sites being considered by the organization is Prado Dam, which is in my region. I know all sites are different, as you explained. What are the lessons learned from Lake Mendocino, and how can you apply those to other reservoirs like Prado?
One of the calculations that needs to be made is it involves how the reservoir is operated. If it's operated such that it may need 2 or 3 days lead time, we can do better at forecasting 2 or 3 days out. If it requires 7 or 10 days, that's going to be a different story. It's very tough to get these storms right 7 or 10 days out. So a lot of it depends on the character of the watershed and the dam itself.
Would that require cooperation of the agencies to be aware of it?
Oh, absolutely, and we've been very well received by agencies wanting to discuss this.
Thank you. Mr. Westerman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For a while, the witnesses had us outnumbered 3-1, but thanks to Ranking Member Graves, we got it down to 2-1 now. And I want to thank the witnesses for your patience and also for your very important testimony, for presenting it to the executive committee of the committee, but more than that, getting it on record because it is important issues that you've talked about. Mr. Ennis, you talked about the inland waterways and the navigation and commerce on those waterways. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how the river closures have affected industries that rely on products that move up and down the river?
Sure. This year's been extreme with the flooding that we've seen. We've seen millions of dollars of cost to us and also delays in projects all over our system because we can't get the products there. And so that's had major impacts on what we've been able to do. And it's really caused delays and put more trucks on the road as well as finding alternative methods to get there, which is not our preferred method. And the delays of getting to let's use St. Paul as an example. We were almost 3 months delayed getting there from when we normally would get there, and the cost and impacts to projects up in that area and further north have been huge for us. And modernizing the system is going to be critical, because if those are modernized, we can recover quicker from a flood event to reduce the cost, and that 75-25 split is going to be crucial to being able to do that.
Thank you for that. Many of you mentioned in your testimony this concept of natural infrastructure. I heard words like designing with nature. I thought of the lyrics to a song that said, I fought the law and the law won. You know, at some point we're going to say, I fought nature and nature won. And I think we're seeing that in a lot of places now. So the question to the panel is, how is the Corps implementing provisions from WRDA's 2016 and 18 to consider natural and nature-based features when studying certain projects? And as a follow-up, is the Corps or non-federal sponsors, are they acting as barriers to considering natural and nature-based designs?
One thing that I'll mention is that we do have some concern that the Corps has not yet done rulemaking from some of the WRDA 2014 or also 2018 related to some of the natural infrastructure. The Corps initiated some rulemaking in February 2015, but we've not seen any proposals 4 years later. So by not having the rulemaking, that's problematic.
Thank you. I will add that I think the direction was very clear that the Army Corps should be considering or must consider natural infrastructure alternatives in projects like flood risk reduction, excuse me. And yet it's very infrequent, almost never do we see a natural infrastructure alternative make it all the way through the planning process and get the same level of analysis of some of the more traditional routes for infrastructure. And I think an issue that a number of folks have mentioned today is the cost-benefit ratio analysis. It seems to be one hurdle to being able to fully analyze the benefits. And of course, Secretary James mentioned himself that he doesn't think they're able to fully interpret the benefits that some of these types of projects provide or options for projects provide. So I definitely think that as we continue to implement those provisions that the committee has made clear, we need to look into that more and help them be able to do the right analysis.
If I may, I'll just be real quick. WRDA 2016, Section 1184, required natural features to be considered in feasibility studies. WRDA 2018, Section 1149, allowed for natural and nature-based features to be included in aquatic ecosystem and flood risk management projects. These were provisions that we strongly supported and I'm pleased were included, but they weren't requirements to do natural infrastructure. And so I think we need to change the framework for how the Corps decides what projects to do, rather than just sort of saying, you know, consider this, or you're allowed to do this. I think that needs to be there needs to be sort of a fundamental switch about how the Corps plans its projects, rather than just asking them to consider the project.
And in my remaining time, Dr. Ralph, we've talked a little bit about innovations and using modern technology. During the flooding in Arkansas, I was out on the river a lot and met a gentleman in his local community. He had developed a sensor that was relatively low cost. He could put it on a metal fence post. He was putting these out on private property, and they were giving real-time water level measurements in hundredth of an inch increments. And you can do all kinds of neat stuff with that kind of data. And he developed this for the irrigation industry. And I said, that's pretty cool technology. Have you talked to the Corps or anybody about using this for monitoring river levels? And he said, you know, the Corps is not interested in talking to somebody like me about new technology. But do you see a hindrance with the Corps in accepting new technology and getting out on the cutting edge of things that could be very beneficial in monitoring current conditions and changing conditions?
Actually, my experience is just the opposite. They've been very open to exploring new approaches. We work directly with the research side of the Corps, which is the Engineer Research Development Center is the lead of that. and we're actively engaged in testing new methods with them.
Yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Marcusel Powell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Hill Gabriel, it's great to have you here with us this afternoon. As you know, I feel like sometimes I sound like a broken record because all I talk about is the situation that we have in my district. The Everglades is part of my district, and we have been working on Everglades restoration now for 2 decades. And I just feel like we have so much to do, and no one seems to have a clear answer on what are the much necessary steps to avoid the catastrophe that we saw last summer and to protect our ecosystem, which is dying, and also the livelihood of so many of millions of Floridians that depend on this ecosystem for water quality and their livelihood, really. So from your perspective, from all the work that you've done, what is it that we can do to speed up the restoration process right now?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think the first thing is, again, a common theme we've heard today, is that for all the success this committee has had in getting new projects authorized, we need help working with colleagues in the Appropriations Committee to make sure those newly authorized projects get funded. The amount of progress that's been able to be made by having the ability to authorize new projects get back on a regular cycle is clear. When you have that level of certainty, it really makes a difference because it filters all the way back down to beginning new planning studies and every step in the process it takes to bring a project up to Congress. When the funding is uncertain, and we've seen that Army Corps funding at times can go up and down, it makes it very difficult not only for the Corps to plan ahead with how much progress can be made in any given year, but it also makes it difficult for the non-federal sponsor to be able to budget accordingly. Where we've seen a lot of progress in the Everglades has been when the non-federal sponsor has taken the lead and said, well, we'll make sure we have the funding in place. So if we're able to get that $200 million in place this fiscal year and future fiscal years, that will make progress happen much, much faster. And as the chairwoman noted in her opening remarks, additional appropriations challenges like limiting the number of new starts can also be a barrier to making progress, not only on the Everglades, but on all of the projects that we're talking about here today. The last thing I'll add is I think that when we have these massive long-term programs, it's easy to find issues along the way that can divert us off of the course of getting projects done and getting the next projects ready. And so really maintaining that focus and keeping our eye on what the ultimate goal is and continuing progress is key.
Well, I was on a mission when I started in January requesting that funding for the Everglades and testified in front of the Appropriations Committee requesting those $200 million. I just worry that now that it has been approved, that the $200 million will help complete some of the planning, not necessarily complete the project. So it'll delay the restoration efforts. So that's a concern of mine. Another question that I wanted to ask you, you spoke about the marshy areas within the lake that could help in filtering some of the toxicity of the water. Can you talk a little bit about that and just explain what else we can be doing to just improve the overwhelming toxicity that we find in the water currently on Lake Okeechobee?
That's right. Often we talk about Lake Okeechobee in terms of, the source of these discharges that go out to coastal estuaries and cause toxic algal blooms. But the lake itself actually has incredibly important habitat. And even if you're not concerned with birds or other wildlife that rely on the lake, it also contains, when it's healthy, up to 150,000 acres of marsh that acts as a natural filtration system. So when we hold lake levels too high for too long or too low for too long, some of that marsh dies out, and so the natural water quality treatment is no longer there. And to put it in perspective, the state of Florida, south of Lake Okeechobee, has built about 65,000 acres of man-made treatment marshes because we found that despite every technology attempted, those treatment marshes were the best way to actually remove the nutrients, that nature won. We couldn't figure out a better option other than nature, replicating nature. So building man-made marshes cost the state over $2 billion. But meanwhile, you have twice that amount in Lake Okeechobee itself if you just keep the lake healthy. So it's important to also consider the habitat on the lake itself in the equation of trying to solve those water quality problems.
Thank you so much. I've run out of time, but maybe I'll ask you some questions after. Thank you.
Mr. Graves, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Mr. Waters, and obviously we've demonstrated just how bad the flooding's been, some of the worst on record. Can you expand a little bit? And I apologize for missing all of the witnesses' opening testimony. I had another commitment, but can you expand a little bit on how this has affected the livelihood and of our communities and our farmers and you know, all of our area, the businesses throughout? And you can focus specifically on the state of Missouri because it's the same whether it's Nebraska or Iowa or Kansas or farther downstream on the Mississippi.
It's been incredible, this event. Number one, I sat on the Highway Commission in Missouri, and at one point we had over 407 roads closed due to the flooding. Some of those were major interstate highways. I-29 that runs up through Missouri and Iowa was closed for numerous days. That alone is a huge economic impact. The farmland that was flooded in Missouri, 1/3 of the crop produced in the state is produced in the 100-year floodplain. We've got a massive amount of that floodplain underwater now. That's going to have a huge impact on the state's economy because agriculture is the #1 industry in the state. And it's not going to end this year because, as I mentioned in my testimony, those levees are going to sit open. The Corps saying that they probably won't get the levees repaired for 2 years. I think it's probably more like 3 to 5 years. And so this thing's going to drag on a long time. And it just trickles through the whole economy of the state, not just the state, but when you put Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska in there, the whole Midwest, and it really will affect food production and trickle through the United States economy. I really believe that.
And can you, just to change gears for just a little bit, real briefly, talk to me a little bit about realignment and setbacks when it comes to the levees and how that's going to impact property owners and some of that farmland?
Sure, I'll talk about a levee breach on my property. The hole that was created when the water came over the levee and breached is 51 feet deep. So filling that hole would be very difficult. So we feel like we're going to have a realignment and ring that hole. So that can be expensive as well, but some of those realignments are, they're necessary. There's no other way to fix them. We heard General Spellman say this morning, just in the levees they've been able to look at, $1.9 billion in levee repairs. That's
preliminary estimate.
That's just a tip of just a few of the levees that they've had a chance to get in and look at. That number is going to continue to increase.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Graves. Mr. LaMalfa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My apologies for my absence here, multiple things at one time, so I appreciate Madam Chair having this hearing and this panel for being here. I wanted to zero in on issues with revolving around Oroville Dam in Northern California, which suffered a spillway breakage a little over 2 years ago, and since then has been rebuilt and is well functioning. The reconstruction of it, which we understand there's certain issues with how lake levels have to be maintained on that, but indeed for 2 years the lake level of Lake Oroville was kept very low in phase with this construction, and it was a risk-averse strategy. And again, it's understandable part of it here, but I think the net effect was the local economic issues faced with that, and I'll be addressing Mr. Ralph with a question on that here in a moment. It hurt the local economy on the recreational side and tourism side, as well as the water supply issues for the state of California. The state does not contribute any real significant funding to Oroville to compensate for the county's responsibility to maintain roads, law enforcement, fire, et cetera. So the county, Butte County calculates approximately $10 million a year of cost to them for providing services that they have little authority to be part of. So with that, the dam, two economic problems that we need help with. We can fix through the FERC relicensing process and see that DWR is a bigger partner going forward on what its costs of the dam to the community are. And then also looking at, again, more directing to Mr. Ralph, looking at the risk and economic impact when we do this. The forecasting model for how the lake level is maintained. Again, it's a different situation when the spillway is being repaired. I thought it was a little conservative, but on low levels. But nonetheless, we're through that, and we've had a great water year this year, 2019. So, Mr. Ralph, I understand you're working on a forecast model with the state of, in hope of updating the 1970s era Army Corps manual for operations of Lake Oroville as well as New Bullard's Bar nearby. They kind of work together. Do you expect this update to be completed at what point?
Yeah, we're working with Yuba Water Agency and California Department of Water Resources in a combined effort on the Yuba and Feather that will involve both New Bullard's Bar and Oroville. We're in the phase now of beginning to develop the work plan to lay out what's needed in terms of our analysis and science to address the issues. We have a target timeline such that our report will generate the inputs into a potential water control manual update in the order of 3 years or so from now.
Okay, when was this first started or proposed of the update?
We just began the work together in May.
Of proposing the idea of changing the manual, or?
I believe that the Yuba Water Agency has already been envisioning a change in the water manual associated with a revision to their release facilities from New Bullard's Bar. So we're working with them very closely and coordinating the timelines. Our committee includes a representative for Oroville Dam from DWR.
Okay, so basically it's a 3-year process from initiated being this year is what you're hoping for?
Right. It's been a 5-year process on Lake Mendocino, and we're accelerating that as we learn along the way.
Okay, kind of use that model as a way to move a little quicker on this one, hopefully, right?
Right, we're learning things we don't have to reinvent, but there are new challenges on Oroville. In particular, the High Sierra and the snowpack is a big technical issue, and we've got to address that.
Yeah, I've noticed, I've looked at a lot of numbers on that where they're, with a big snowpack up there, there's a lot of fear about that snowpack melting all at once, but every number I ever watched on CFS input has been pretty conservative. I mean, pretty low numbers. It hasn't been the rush of water coming into the lake. I know that farther down, more in Central California, those rivers do really rage when snowmelt happens, but up in our area, it seems it's not as big of a concern. So when I watch how they're managing lake level, it seems like there might be just a little bit of overemphasis on that. So I hope as you're modeling this, that what kind of improvements do you think we can allow to keep the lake fuller longer into the year so that we have that water supply issue for the rest of the state as well as the local economic and tourist issues? Is there a way to aggressively look at this model and keep more water in a longer period and still have the margin of safety that's reasonable?
Yeah, our effort is going to look both at increasing water supply reliability in a way as you're envisioning there, but also flood control mitigation capacity through pre-releases. This is aligned with the new release structure that New Bullard's Bar is envisioning that will allow them to make releases at a lower water level in the reservoir.
Okay. So what I noticed at Oroville, we have a lot of capacity through the Hyatt power plant to maintain, and then the spillway itself is designed for a lot of ability to spill safely within the river system. So it looks to me like we can certainly be a little more aggressive on keeping the lake full longer and still have that margin of safety. So please look into that, and I'll yield back, Madam Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lamalfa. We are going to go into a second round, very brief, but to the panel, all of you, why is it important that Congress continue to enact WRDA?
Well, I'd just say we've got a lot of problems out there, Madam Chairman. We've got flood control structure all over the country that needs improvements, needs to be put back where it has been damaged. There are problems across this whole country, and as I said in my testimony, wake up in the morning, turn the TV on, you'll see it flooding somewhere in the country nearly every day.
I very much agree with Tom in terms of the problem, and when you also add sea level rise, it is something that will be among the national priorities I think we are dealing with in this century. We need to have the full expertise and the resources of the Corps of Engineers, but also take a broader floodplain management approach that includes flood control. Thank you.
The biggest thing that we've seen is the impact of WRDA hitting every 2 years. I mean, the impact that we've seen to the inland waterway system has been huge. We've started to see projects completed and move forward, and having that continue is going to be critical so that we can get these 15 priority projects done, and the cost share will be the next thing to hurdle. Thank you.
Water is life's most critical element. And I think as the changing climate means we're going to see stronger storms, sea level rise, flooding in some places and drought in others, there's probably no more important issue than advancing water infrastructure.
The Army Corps of Engineers is our nation's most critical agency in addressing many of the water challenges, but certainly the coastal challenges we face, and they need to have the full tools at their disposal and have the authorization to implement projects, and that's done by WRDA every 2 years.
I see WRDA as providing a venue for dialogue about innovation and new approaches that could be helpful in the long term.
Well, that seems to be the topic for everybody, that we need WRDA, we need the resources, and we need your expertise to be able to make sure that we address all the issues. And I'd like to ask my colleague, Mr. Westerman, for his comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I really look forward to working with you and the committee on getting another WRDA in 2020. It's something we definitely need to do. Your testimony is extremely valuable in helping us prepare for that, and I would like to yield the rest of my time to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Graves.
He has a full 5 minutes. I recognize Mr. Graves.
Sure. Thanks, Madam Chair. Just real quick, I was reading through your testimony, Mr. Waters, and you talk about the long and short-term needs necessary to get folks back on their feet and prevent future events. So from your perspective, can you go into a little bit more depth on how the Corps is going to balance different purposes like fish and wildlife, obviously to the detriment of flood control in many cases, but that as well as some of the potential proposed solutions that have been offered up, obviously from your perspective?
Well, currently, the Corps is trying to balance 8 authorized purposes with the Missouri River flood control system, and they're trying to balance all those equally. Well, they're not equal. This system was built for flood control, and so we have to set a priority on flood control. And when we do that, we're not tossing away the other authorized purposes. When the system was built for flood control, all these other purposes and all these other benefits of a system came about. So they'll still be there, but to manage this system, to protect lives and property, it has to be managed for flood control. And so we've got to get back to that, and I think one of the first places that we can start is with the dike notching that I talked about. If we can get these dikes fixed so the water flows downstream. Right now, with all the notched dikes, as the water comes down the river, it hits those dikes and swirls. And so it's swirling its way down the stream. If you look at the Illinois and the Ohio River, those riverbanks are straight and smooth, and the water flows right down the river. But we've been doing some of these, I call them experiments, and these projects that we've done have damaged the flood control system. And we're seeing the results of it now. We're seeing more flooding more often.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Chair now recognizes Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank all of you for being here today and providing your input. We talked on the first panel a little bit about the backlog of the Corps of Engineers, and I want to state for the record unequivocally that I could not more disagree with Secretary James's comment that the backlog only consists of projects that have been partially funded. Congress doesn't earmark projects. I couldn't disagree more with the way that he categorized that. If a project has been authorized by this committee, by this Congress, it is a backlog project, period. There's a way to take projects out of the authorization process through a deauthorization. If a project is authorized, it is an authorized project and it's part of the backlog, period. But moving on, you all have experience in water resource projects in some degree. Let me ask you, just show of hands, how many of you are satisfied or think that the existing water resources project development and delivery process is adequate or corresponds with the urgency of the projects that you've worked on? Madam Chair, I just want to let the record reflect that no one's hand is up right now. So you, I'm guessing, have worked on water resource projects outside of this Corps of Engineers confine. And look, I'm not beating up on an individual. It's a process. I think the organizational structure is flawed. Congress has some culpability. I do think you have people in the agencies and OMB that have culpability. But looking across your entire portfolio of experience, can you talk about, giving you a magic wand, what are some of the things that you would change based on how you've seen project development and project implementation occur working with a county, a parish, a state, or a not-for-profit or other groups? And Ms. Hill, Gabriel, feel free to throw some shout-outs for Louisiana. Madam Chair, for the record, I want to make mention of a National Geographic article that said that the Florida Everglades was a petting zoo compared to the ecological productivity of coastal Louisiana. I would never say those things. I'm just quoting someone else. But regardless, if I could get y'all's feedback on that question, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I would just say there's a lot of bureaucracy involved in every project. Even some, I've been talking about levee repairs, but some of those repair projects drag on for a very long time as you deal with regulations and rules within the Corps of Engineers and even beyond the Corps. We have to do environmental studies. We have to gather easements and property rights. So there's so much bureaucracy in that. The timetable just for putting one levee back together is extremely long, and so that's
Mr.
why
Waters,
I said maybe 3 to 5 years to get this done.
Is there a project that you've worked on outside of this Corps of Engineer federal confine that you say, you know what, that worked?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Which one? Can you give me?
Through the NRCS. We have projects, and they're water
Another
projects.
federal agency.
Yeah, but as a farmer, I can go to the NRCS. They can design my project and give me the plans, and then I can go outside and find my own contractor to come and build it, and then get reimbursed for that, for the cost share or whatever. So allowing me to do the contracting and taking care of a lot of that stuff that the Corps does on the Corps water project saves a tremendous amount of money.
And Madam Chair, going back to the dialogue we had with Secretary James earlier, this 1043 process largely, well, to some degree, provides for that. The Corps wrote 149 pages of guidance, so I haven't had a chance to go through it all, but I'm not sure that it's as efficient as NRCS, but it's designed to mimic that process where you can use the efficiencies of your own contracting and things along those lines. And so I do think making sure that we prevent that authorization from expiring is very important.
When you finish reading it, let us know.
Yes, ma'am. I'll send you the Cliff Notes. Any others care to comment on this?
So another thing on adequacy, I think, is that, and Derek had mentioned this earlier, is that for natural infrastructure or for non-structural, the approach is incremental, and it's if the sponsor desires it, as opposed to being an automatic part of project development or repair. For example, in PL 8499, why isn't it that we don't, as a nation, have a rapid buyout program for people that want to just get out of the heck out of harm's way?
Or better yet, why don't we look at the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the Corps of Engineers CG program, and instead of prohibiting each one of these from being able to commingle or work together, actually encouraging them to do so, to where we can achieve some of these greater objectives, like where it makes sense buyout, where it makes sense commingle funds and address the backlog of projects and others. Certainly a lot of efficiencies that I think we could incorporate, but we're going to address the rest of that through questions for the record. But I want to thank you again for being here today. Yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Mr. Malone for a short one.
Yep. Thank you for another round here. We'll try and do it halftime. Coming back to Mr. Ralph, since we have a little time, I just wanted to follow up on some of those Lake Oroville thoughts here. What kind of improvements do you think in the manual we can achieve that will allow us to keep more water in longer, especially in the summer months, so we have better recreation and tourism, as well as what it means for agriculture in the southern part of the state, and et cetera?
Not being an expert on the water control manual process, I'm an atmospheric scientist. I'd like to get back to you on that if possible.
Okay, and then I'll follow up. Again, we have the ability for a mass amount of water to flow through the powerhouse and the newly rebuilt spillway. The spillway is large enough to overwhelm the levee system down below with its capacity. So how far out do you think a forecast model could project when we would need to start releasing water to stay within that safe range of a full lake, in the winter months, but not too full so we have an orderly release, but still, again, gearing towards a full lake at the end of the springtime, How might that compare to the standard that DWR is already able to use working with Army Corps?
I can't tell you numbers off the top of my head, but I can say that factors that come into play are how fast water can be released from the reservoir, what amount of water needs to be released, what the conveyance system is downstream, how far it needs to go, and each reservoir has its own particulars of that. And that's what our work plan is developed, is intending to quantify very carefully. In the case of Lake Mendocino, for example, the number we came up with as a committee was 10,000 acre-feet of additional water supply reliability. Lake Mendocino is 1/10 the size of New Bullards Bar. It's a fraction of Oroville. And based on the release structure and the rates that have been allowable, it would take about 2 days to release that water. And then Guerneville is a town downstream that is flood prone. It would take about 1 to 3 days for that back edge of that surge of water to get past Guerneville. So you add the 2 days to get the water out of the dam, up to 3 days to get out of the way, that's 5 days. That gives us our lead time requirement for adequate forecast skill so as to enable FIRO to work on Lake Mendocino.
Yeah.
So we'll have to go through those calculations very carefully with regards to the system.
Makes perfect sense. You're either limited by the size of the spillway or the system below the levees is river to, in this case, it's the river structure that's going to limit how much can go without unneeded damage. So I'd be very interested to see how a little more modernized look at what the snowpack release would be, so what's incoming to the lake is more realistic instead of, the more great level of concern, maybe unneeded on that. So with that, I'll yield back, and please keep me apprised as you're going along on that. We're very interested in that work as it unfolds. So thank you for that, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. LaMalfa. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them by members of this committee in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments, information submitted by members or the witnesses to be included in record of today's hearing. So without objection? No objection? So ordered. I would like to thank General James, Secretary James left, but he was here for a good portion of your testimony, and I thank him for that. And General Spellman, thank you very much for staying. Recognize your presence and thankful for it. And to the witnesses, thank you for your patience, and we thank you for your testimony and bid you goodbye. Subcommittee stands adjourned.